There is a moment near the end of Dead Space 3 where running stops being useful. Isaac Clarke is standing on broken ground on a planet that has been frozen since long before anything on Earth had a spine, and the sky above him has come apart. Something is descending through the cloud layer. There is a mouth in it. Two eyes sit in a face the size of a landmass, and both of them have found him. Most people remember that moment as the biggest monster in the series. That reading is the one the game hands you for free, and it is also the smallest possible version of what is actually happening on screen. Over the next several hours we are going to take the Brethren moons apart and put them back together in a different order. We will start with what a moon physically is, which almost nobody explains properly, and then work backward through the signal, the markers, the outbreaks, the church that worshipped the process, and the frozen half-finished god hanging in orbit over Tau Volantis. Along the way we are going to look at how the gameplay itself has been arguing this thesis since the first hour of the first game, and we will hold the moons up against the other great monsters of science fiction horror to see what makes them genuinely different from all of them. What follows is an interpretation of the Dead Space material, rather than a retelling of it. Think of this as an argument about what the series was quietly building toward from the moment you first stepped onto the Ishimura, assembled out of details the games scatter around and then decline to explain out loud. By the end, you will understand why the horror of the Brethren moons has almost nothing to do with how large they are. You will also understand why calling them villains might be the most comfortable mistake this fandom has ever made. If something in this deep dive lands for you, drop a comment and tell me what part of it connected. Maybe it was a specific detail you had never noticed, maybe it was a moment that made the whole series click differently, or maybe it was just a section that sat with you afterward. And if you have a game you want pulled apart like this, leave the suggestion. Some of the best videos on this channel started as a single comment from somebody who could not sleep. So now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us start. Chapter 1. The Thing in Orbit. Before we can ask whether we misunderstood the Brethren moons, we have to be honest about how few people can actually describe one. So this first section answers a simple question with a very unsimple answer. What, physically, is that thing in the sky? Start with the arrival. On Tau Volantis, the clouds do not part the way weather parts. They are pushed. Something enormous is coming down out of orbit into the upper atmosphere, and the first thing you register is not a shape at all. Light changes. The color of the daylight shifts. Shadows on the ice go long and wrong, and then the ground begins to lift. Fragments of the planet tear loose and rise. Whole shelves of frozen rock drift upward, slowly, the way silt lifts off a riverbed when something big moves through the water. Gravity is still present. It has simply lost the argument. And then the face resolves. Here is what you are looking at. That object is a necromorph. Not a creature commanded by necromorphs, not a vessel carrying them, not a machine that manufactures them. The thing filling your sky belongs to the same biological family as the shambling, reassembled corpse that came out of a vent and tried to open you up in the first hour of the first game. Same infection, same architecture, same logic. The only difference is how much material it was allowed to gather before it finished growing. That single fact reorganizes the entire franchise, and it is worth sitting with. Every horror you fought across 3 games was an early developmental stage. The slasher in the corridor was not a failed monster. It was an interrupted one. Each of those things was a partial assembly, a fragment of an organism that never received enough biological material to become what it was always going to become. You spent 3 games killing infants. The moon is what happens when nobody kills them. Now the composition, because this is where people's mental image usually goes wrong. When a convergence event runs its full course, the reanimated tissue and the corpses within the marker's reach are pulled up off the surface into the stratosphere, where they fuse into a single mass. That mass becomes the living core. At the same time, an enormous quantity of the planet's own crust is torn free and drawn up with it, and that rock and mineral matter settles around the outside as a shell. So the object hanging over Tau Volantis has a body made from the dead of an entire civilization. wearing an outer layer made from the surface of the world that civilization lived on. Consider the cruelty embedded in that design. When one of these things finishes forming, the planet below it is not simply depopulated. Part of it has been disassembled and worn. Whatever that species built, whatever they wrote down, whatever they argued about for however many thousands of years, all of it ends up as structural material in the shell of the thing that ate them. At the center of the mass, the marker rises. This detail turns the whole picture from horror into something closer to an industrial process. Once the body has finished coming together, the marker that triggered the event levitates inward toward the heart of the new organism and begins to broadcast. That broadcast has a specific function. Completion gets announced. The rest of the network is told that a new member has finished forming and is ready to participate. There is a network. Those 3 words do an enormous amount of work, and the games are careful about when they let you have them. For 2 entire installments, the enemy appears to be a local problem, a ship, then a station, then a colony. Something went wrong in one specific place, and you happen to be inside it. Only in the 3rd game does the camera pull back far enough to show that the local problem was never local, that these organisms exist in numbers across the stars, and that they are aware of each other. They also have opinions about themselves. The moons describe their own existence in the language of divinity, immortal, all-powerful, a manifestation of God. That framing comes from them directly, delivered into the minds of the people they contact. And the easy thing to do with that information is to file it as a lie, as predatory mimicry, as an anglerfish waving a little glowing lure in the dark. Hold that impulse for a second, because it is going to matter later. Consider what the claim actually contains. Something that has existed for an unknown and enormous length of time, that cannot be killed by any conventional means available to the species it harvests, that spans a galaxy, that speaks directly into minds across interstellar distance, and that has consumed every civilization it has ever met. Measured against a human being, the claim is not obviously false. From inside a human life, almost none of it can even be tested. The moons may be describing themselves accurately, and we simply do not like the description. There is a version of this video that would stop right there and call it a day, because the idea of a monster that is telling the truth about its own divinity is a satisfying place to rest. I want to keep pulling, because the more interesting thing is what the games do with your hands rather than what they do with your ears. So let me pull the camera back to the fight itself. You do not shoot the moon. No weapon in the entire arsenal meaningfully damages an object of that size, and the game knows it, so the encounter is built around a completely different idea. What you get instead is a stasis amplification field and a supply of red markers floating loose in the vortex, and the job in front of you is to take the enemy's own reproductive hardware and drive it into the enemy's eyes. Sit with the design of that. The only thing in the universe demonstrably capable of hurting one of these organisms is the technology that creates them. Human weapons are irrelevant. Ordnance of any kind does nothing. This creature is vulnerable to precisely one category of object, and that category is itself, which raises an obvious question about the thing that finally brought it down, and the answer is that a human being did not bring it down either. The machine that killed the Tau Volantis moon was built by the species native to that planet, designed by people who had already lost. It was a last act by a civilization in the process of being consumed, and it was never properly finished. When Isaac reaches it and reconfigures it, he is completing a job somebody else started an incomprehensibly long time ago and ran out of species to complete. He is a technician working from an abandoned blueprint left by the dead. Humanity's great victory in Dead Space 3 is repairing alien equipment. That is the first real crack in the way this fandom usually talks about these things. In most horror, the monster is the obstacle, and the protagonist is the solution. Here the protagonist functions closer to a component. Isaac is the piece of hardware that happens to be standing in the right place at the right time, with the right neurological damage, to finish a device built by a species he never met, aimed at an organism he did not know existed until a few hours earlier. Compare that to how science fiction horror usually resolves. because the contrast is instructive. In Alien, the creature is finally dealt with by a woman who understands the airlock better than the company understands the creature. Human competence wins. In The Thing, the standoff is intimate and paranoid, and the terror is that the enemy is wearing your friends, but the scale never leaves the camp. A flamethrower remains a relevant tool. Both of those stories keep the human being at the center of the solution, even when the ending is bleak. Dead Space takes that centrality away by degrees, and the third game finally names what it has been doing. The scale of the threat is such that human effort barely registers as a variable. What saves the day is a piece of foreign infrastructure, and what it saves is a single planet, temporarily. The literary tradition that best matches this is not the monster movie at all. It goes back further, to a body of horror fiction built on the idea that the universe contains intelligences so much older and larger than us that our moral categories do not apply to them. Those stories were not interested in evil. Their central move was to describe something enormous, indifferent, and busy with purposes of its own, and then to observe a human mind failing to survive contact with the scale of it. Dead Space belongs to that tradition, and the Brethren Moons are the moment the franchise admits it. There is one more comparison worth making, because it clarifies what kind of enemy we are dealing with better than any of the others. Think about the creature in The Thing. Its horror comes from imitation. It gets inside a group by wearing the people in it, and every scene becomes a test of who can be trusted, which is why that film lives in the memory as a story about paranoia rather than a story about a monster. Trust is the resource being consumed. The organism is a device for destroying it. Now put a Brethren Moon in the same room. It does not imitate anybody. Nothing about it hides, nothing about it needs your trust, and it has no interest whatsoever in whether the people below it get along. Concealment would be pointless, because there is no meaningful action you could take with the information. A moon can announce itself openly, sit in orbit in plain view, describe its intentions directly into your head, and lose nothing by doing so. That is a completely different flavor of fear, and it is much harder to write. Paranoia horror assumes you have some power, which is why hiding matters. A creature that hides is a creature that can be outmaneuvered. When the threat stops bothering to conceal itself, what you are being told is that your knowledge was never the deciding factor, which is exactly the position every human being in this series occupies from the beginning. There is also the matter of the name. 2 words sit on the cover of every game in this franchise, and most people read them as a description of the setting, meaning outer space, meaning a place where people die. The phrase has a second meaning inside the fiction, around the marker. At the moment convergence begins, the gathered mass arranges itself in a ring, leaving a still and empty zone at the center. An eye at the middle of the storm, a dead space. The title was describing the ritual geometry the whole time. I want to be careful here because this is the kind of observation that can turn into a party trick. The reason it matters is what it tells you about the structure of the story. Dead Space is a series that keeps its largest ideas in plain sight and trusts you not to see them, which is a strange kind of confidence for a horror franchise to have. It puts the ending in the chapter list, the cosmology goes in the title, and then it spends its actual runtime showing you corridors, because a corridor is a thing a person can handle. Let me go back to that word network one more time, because the implication inside it is larger than it first appears. A single planet-sized organism is a spectacle. Several of them, spread across the stars, aware of one another, capable of communication over distances that make communication meaningless, is a different category of thing entirely. What you are being shown at the end of the third game is not a creature. You are being shown a population, and populations behave differently from individuals. An individual predator can be avoided, territory can be mapped, ranges can be learned, and there are places it does not go. Populations do not work that way. Distribution is what a population does. Wherever the conditions support it, eventually something arrives, and the arrival does not require intent from any particular member, which means the correct mental image for the Brethren Moons is closer to a species than to a villain, and closer to a distribution map than to a war. Notice how that changes the emotional shape of the ending. When the Tau Volantis moon dies, the natural feeling is relief, and the game very deliberately gives you about 90 seconds of it. Isaac survives a fall he should not survive. The sky clears. Something enormous lies broken on the horizon, and the immediate conclusion is that the signal has stopped and the danger is over. Then the vision arrives, and with it the information that the dying moon managed to reach its brethren before it went down. Incomplete, half-formed, mortally damaged, and still capable of making one phone call. I want to underline how unusual that structure is for a horror game. Almost every entry in the genre ends on a version of the same beat, where the protagonist destroys the threat and walks out changed. Here, destroying the threat is what completes it. The single act of resistance that finally succeeds is the same act that carries the message outward, which is a genuinely cruel piece of writing and also a deeply consistent one. Nothing about the cycle needed you to lose. What it needed was for something to happen loudly enough to be noticed. Whether the people who wrote that intended it as a comment on how alarm systems work, I could not tell you. What I can say is that it holds up under pressure, and we will come back to it near the end of this video when we ask whether Isaac's victory should be counted as a victory at all. Now here is where this chapter has to leave you unsatisfied, because canon leaves us unsatisfied. We know how a Brethren moon is made. Marker lands, species finds it, species builds copies, outbreak spreads, biomass accumulates, convergence pulls everything skyward, and a new moon forms and joins the network. The cycle closes and sustains itself. Each moon produces the markers that produce the outbreaks that produce the next moon. A closed loop still has to start somewhere. Something had to be first. Some original organism must have existed before any markers existed to manipulate anyone into building anything, because markers come from moons, and moons come from markers, and both halves of that sentence cannot be the beginning. The material never answers this. There is no origin story for the first moon. No scene where somebody finds the record. No log that explains where the cycle was struck. What the games are content to do is show you a machine already running and let you notice on your own and much later that you never saw it switched on. I am not going to invent an answer for you. What I will point out is that the silence is doing work. A monster with an origin can be understood, because an origin gives you a first cause to be angry at, an inventor, a moment where a decision was made that could have gone another way. Without one, you are left with a process that appears to have simply always been happening, in the same way erosion has always been happening. And this process reached Earth long before there was anyone here to notice, 65 million years before, to be specific. Which means the thing you eventually fought, in orbit above a frozen planet, had already made its move against your species, while your ancestors were small, warm, nocturnal animals with no particular future. There is one more detail worth holding on to before we go backward in time, and it is the kind of thing that only lands once you know to look for it. The chapter titles of the third game are not decorative. Take the first letter of each one in order, and they spell out a sentence, and the sentence is an announcement that the brothers are dead. The reveal was sitting in the menu the entire time you played. Chapter 2. A signal older than us. We have established what a Brethren moon is and how one gets built. This section goes backward, to the arrival, and to the single piece of technology that makes any of it possible. The question here is simple. How does a rock convince an entire species to build its own executioner? Start with the impact. 65 million years ago, an object came into the atmosphere over what is now the Yucatan Peninsula and struck the Earth with enough force to be visible in the geological record forever afterward. That impact belongs to real science. It sits among the most studied events in the planet's history, tied to the end of the dinosaurs, written into a layer of sediment you can walk up to and touch on multiple continents. In the world of Dead Space, that asteroid was carrying something. The black marker rode down inside it, and then it sat there, buried in the wreckage of an extinction event, on a planet where the most sophisticated thing alive was a reptile, and it began doing the only thing it knows how to do. It transmitted. Everything after this follows from understanding what the signal actually does, and the signal does two separate things that people constantly collapse into one. The first effect works on the living mind. Exposure produces a condition that looks, from the outside, like a degenerative mental illness. Hallucinations, paranoia, then fixation, then violence. Loss of the ability to distinguish what is in the room from what is being generated internally. All of that is thoroughly documented across the series, and it is the horror everyone remembers because you experience it directly through Isaac. The second effect is quieter and infinitely more important. In some people, the signal does more than degrade the mind. A compulsion gets installed. What emerges is a drive to build a copy. That is the entire mechanism. Everything else is downstream. The marker does not need to conquer anybody. What it needs is somebody with hands, a functioning technical civilization, and enough exposure to develop the itch. Ordinary behavior handles the rest. Once one copy exists, copies spread the way any valuable technology spreads, and the number of transmitters on the planet begins to climb. Here is the part that makes the design genuinely brilliant rather than merely sinister. The marker offers something real. Its signal represents an apparently limitless source of electromagnetic energy. That is a legitimate reason to study one, and an equally legitimate reason to build one. Picture a species running out of power, strip mining its own worlds, cracking planets open for what is inside them. Into that situation arrives an object that appears to emit usable energy without consuming fuel. No manipulation is required to make that attractive. The thing is genuinely useful, right up until the moment it is genuinely fatal. Compare that to how traps work in the natural world, because the resemblance is not accidental. Certain deep-sea predators carry a light on a stalk in front of their mouths. That light is real light. Anything drawn to it is not being deceived about the existence of the light, only about what the light is attached to. Research into parasitic organisms that manipulate host behavior has found the same architecture over and over. The most effective manipulations do not fight the host's instincts, they ride them. A parasite that drives an insect to climb toward the sun is not overriding a desire to stay low. It amplifies something the insect was already inclined to do, and then steers the outcome. The marker rides curiosity. It rides ambition. Most of all, it rides the specific hunger of an industrial civilization for a power source that never runs out. Which brings us to the other half of the signal, the half that operates on the dead. Transmission alters necrotic tissue at the molecular level. Corpses within range do not simply reanimate in the way a zombie film would mean. They get restructured. Limbs elongate into blades. Torsos split and reorganize. Bodies are rebuilt into configurations that serve functions the original organism never had, and the results are coordinated enough to hunt. This is where Dead Space separates itself from almost everything around it, and it is worth being specific about why. In the standard zombie framework, death is a change of state. You were a person, now you are a hostile thing, and the thing retains your shape because your shape is all it has to work with. The tragedy is preservation. Something recognizably you keeps walking around, which is exactly what makes it unbearable. The Necromorph framework treats the body as raw material. Your shape carries no sentimental value in the process. It is inventory. What you were gets taken apart and rebuilt according to a specification that has nothing to do with you, and the horror lands as dispossession. Something took your body and made something else out of it, without needing your permission, your consciousness, or your consent, because it never wanted any of those things to begin with. Look at what that means for the people in the story. When the Ishimura's crew starts dying, they are not being murdered by an enemy that wants them dead. Death is a manufacturing step into a resource that is easy to use. Living people are a problem for the process. Corpses are an asset. The violence is procedural, which is a much colder thing to be on the receiving end of than hatred. And the process has a patience that is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. That marker sat under the Yucatan for 200 million years, It waded through the rise of mammals, through the primates, through the entire history of everything that has ever been called human. Waiting is the wrong word, because waiting implies expectation, and there is no evidence that anything about the marker anticipates. Transmission continues at whatever rate transmission continues, and eventually a species arrives that can hear it. Some readings of the material go further and suggest the signal was shaping development the whole time. The idea is that the presence of the transmitter influenced how life on the planet evolved, nudging it toward intelligence and technical capability, because a marker requires a species capable of building things. What the material states plainly is that the signal drives intelligent species toward replication. Whether it also grew the intelligence it later exploits sits in the space between reading and documented fact, and I would rather flag the line than pretend it is not there. Either way, the arithmetic is grim. Humanity did not stumble into an alien threat while expanding outward into space. Our species developed on top of one. Let us come back to something concrete, because that idea can go abstract fast. Picture a research facility. Somewhere inside it, a man in a white room is looking at readouts from an object that should not exist, feeling the beginning of an idea he believes is his own. He is excited. Nobody has tortured or coerced or possessed him. What he is experiencing feels exactly like the best thought of his professional life. And the thought is that this thing could be replicated, that the energy problem might be solvable, that the work in front of him might be the most important work anyone has ever done. None of that feels like infection, which is precisely why it works. Real research into how people form convictions has found something uncomfortable and consistent. The feeling of certainty and the quality of the reasoning behind it are only loosely connected. Certainty gets produced by its own machinery, and that machinery can be triggered by things that have nothing to do with evidence. Fatigue can do it. Repetition does it reliably. Emotional stakes do it best of all. Once the feeling arrives, the mind backfills reasons with impressive speed and total sincerity. Now imagine a device that reaches directly into that machinery. The people who built red markers were not weak-minded. They were doing what everyone does with a strong conviction, which is treating it as a conclusion they reached rather than a state they were placed into. The tragedy scattered through this series is not stupidity. What you are watching is a very ordinary kind of confidence arriving from the wrong direction, and it scales. One person with a compulsion is a curiosity. A research division with the same compulsion becomes a program. Put it in a government, and it becomes an infrastructure project, at which point the number of transmitters on a planet stops being a scientific question and turns into an industrial output. Every copy widens the affected population. Each widening produces more people who want to build more copies. The curve steepens on its own, without anything steering it after the first push. By the time anyone in the story is positioned to understand what is happening, the machinery is far past the point where understanding helps. Something else grows alongside the hardware, and it deserves a mention here even though it gets a full chapter later. When a compulsion spreads through a population, it does not stay a private experience for very long. People compare notes. Those who feel the pull find each other, and once a few of them are in the same room, the pull stops looking like a symptom and starts looking like a shared insight. A private conviction becomes a group conviction, and group convictions are enormously more durable than individual ones, because leaving now costs you the group as well as the belief. That is the seed of the church, and the church is the reason this story keeps escalating past the point where any sane institution would have stopped. For now, the important part is the sequence. Signal first, compulsion second, community third, and only then the theology. Everything unitology teaches arrives after the mechanism was already running, which means the religion is not the cause of anything. It is a report, written by people describing an experience they were having, in the only vocabulary available to them. There is a specific flavor of dread in that, and it is the reason this series ages better than its contemporaries. Most horror asks whether the characters will figure it out in time. Dead Space keeps demonstrating that figuring it out changes very little. Knowledge arrives on schedule and does nothing. People understand the marker perfectly well and continue building them. In the same way, a person can understand exactly what is wrong with a habit and keep the habit. Before we move on, I want to put a face on the abstraction, because so far this chapter has been describing a mechanism, and mechanisms are easy to listen to. Go back to the Ishimura. Picture the medical deck at the point where the crew has understood roughly what is happening and has not yet stopped believing there is a procedure for it. Corridors that were designed for maintenance schedules and shift rotations are now being used for something no designer anticipated. Somebody has written on a wall. Because the messaging systems have failed, and writing on a wall is what people do when the ordinary channels stop working. The writing is instructional. It is somebody's last useful contribution, left for a stranger who might arrive later, and it explains how to fight the things in the halls. That is the moment where the horror of this series becomes specific rather than atmospheric. A person who is going to die soon spent part of their remaining time on a message for somebody they will never meet. There is enormous dignity in that, and it does not help. The process below decks does not care about the message, does not register the dignity, and continues at exactly the same rate it was already running. Everything that happens on the Ishimura is happening at the scale of individuals, and everything that is causing it is operating at the scale of geology. That mismatch is the actual engine of dead space. Human time runs in shifts and relationships, and the amount of oxygen left in a room. The other clock runs in tens of millions of years and does not have a second hand. Real historians of extinction events have a phrase for the difference between the time a species experiences and the time a planet experiences, and the gap between them is one of the harder things for a human mind to hold. We are built for the timescale of a season. Anything beyond a few generations becomes an abstraction rather than a feeling, and this series takes that limitation and builds its entire cosmology inside it, because the marker's advantage over us is almost entirely temporal. It can afford to be slow, nothing that opposes it can. There is a further consequence worth naming, and it will come back in the final third of this video. If a process like this exists and functions, then every civilization it reaches ends at roughly the same developmental moment. Not at the beginning, when a species is too primitive to matter, and not at some distant peak of achievement either. The end arrives precisely when a species becomes capable of building complex technology, which is the same moment it becomes capable of building a marker copy. Capability and destruction arrive together as two aspects of the same milestone. Scientists thinking about why the universe seems so quiet have proposed something structurally identical. The suggestion is that somewhere along the path from simple life to a civilization that spreads between stars, there is a step almost nothing gets past. Nobody knows where that step sits. It might be behind us, or it might still be ahead. Dead Space answers the question with an organism, and the answer it gives is that the barrier is neither an accident nor a phase of development. Something is standing there on purpose, and it has been standing there for a very long time. So here is where I want to leave you before the next section, because we are about to get into the mechanics of convergence itself, and I think most people have the shape of that event wrong in a specific and interesting way. Convergence usually gets described as the moment the markers finish their attack. That framing has a problem. Attacks have targets, and the more closely you look at what actually occurs when a convergence event runs, the less any of it resembles something aimed at anybody. The event has a shape, and the shape sits much closer to a birth than to a bombing. There is a further wrinkle waiting for us. The game has been explaining all of this to you through its controls since the first hour of the first game, in the single most famous mechanic in the entire franchise. And almost nobody reads it that way. Every time you lift the plasma cutter and turn it sideways, you are rehearsing the moon's own logic back at them. I will show you exactly how in the next chapter. Chapter 3. The Architecture of a Birth. We have been talking about convergence as an endpoint, the catastrophic conclusion of everything the marker sets in motion. Now I want to look more closely at the event itself because the way it actually runs is almost never described in full, and the details matter enormously for understanding what kind of thing we are dealing with. Start with the signal that precedes everything. Before convergence begins, the marker transmits. This particular transmission goes to the hive mind, the massive necromorph form that sits at the top of the outbreak's local hierarchy and coordinates everything below it. The hive mind is not an individual organism in any straightforward sense. It is a specialized form, evolved by the same infection that produced everything else, and its function is command, where individual necromorphs chase and kill with the indiscriminate drive of animals. The hive mind provides the architecture above them, relaying the marker's directives downward through the horde. Think of the structure as a telephone tree built out of dead tissue. The marker is at the top. From there, the hive mind receives direction and passes it downward. Each necromorph below acts within that structure, hunting and gathering with the singular purpose of accumulating biomass, while the hive mind ensures the horde stays organized around the marker's timeline. What the transmission from the marker tells the hive mind when the biomass threshold is finally reached is that the moment has arrived. The necromorphs respond. All of them, any that can move, begin making their way to the marker. And here is the choreography that nobody talks about, because most descriptions of convergence skip it entirely, in favor of the spectacle that follows. They gather in a circle. Every necromorph that reaches the marker positions itself around its base, and the resulting shape is a ring with an empty center. Around the marker, that quiet zone the game's title was always describing becomes the axis of what is about to happen. A ring of reassembled dead, standing in place around an object, leaving a deliberate gap at the center. Hold that image. The visual is not chaotic, it is ceremonial, and that quality is precisely what makes it so deeply wrong to witness. Chaos from a mindless infection is expected. Ceremony from one implies something inside the process that has a relationship with shape, with structure, with the deliberate arrangement of components before a larger action. What the marker does next makes the arrangement make sense. Energy bursts from it in massive pulses. A sound emerges that reads as industrial, somewhere between a foghorn and something structural coming apart. A sound associated with enormous mechanical force rather than with anything biological. The wind around the base begins to move with purpose, and the vortex forms. Reaching upward through the cloud layer, it pulls everything within range. The pull is indiscriminate between categories of matter, treating the gathered necromorphs and the surrounding dead tissue and the rock and soil of the planet itself as equivalent inputs. All of it begins rising. The necromorphs go first, flung upward into the air above the marker, and the process of fusion begins immediately. Mass meets mass in the stratosphere and does not remain separate. What goes up from here does not come down in individual pieces. The planet tears. Large sections of the crust, whatever lies within the pull's reach, lift away from the surface and join the ascending column. These fragments are not absorbed into the biological core. Their function is structural rather than biological, settling around the outside of the fusing mass as a protective shell, giving the forming entity an exterior that reads as geological, even though what is inside it is alive. The marker rises last. When the body has finished coming together, the same object that triggered the entire sequence floats inward through the mass and takes its position at the heart of the new organism. At that point, it begins to broadcast, and what the broadcast announces to the other moons across the galaxy is that the process is complete. A new member of the network has finished forming and is ready to participate. Now take a step back, because there is a reading of this sequence that nobody who talks about dead space ever says out loud. Nothing in that process was aimed at the living. Consider each step. The signal goes to the hive mind, whose function has always been to coordinate the dead. Necromorphs gather, assembled from corpses. What the vortex pulls upward is biomass, meaning dead tissue, meaning nothing that was still living when convergence began. Crustal fragments rise as structural material, and the planet has never been alive in any relevant sense. At the center of the new organism sits the marker. surrounded entirely by things that were already dead before a single burst of energy was released. The living population was relevant to the process before convergence. During the outbreak phase, when the task was to create as many corpses as possible as quickly as possible, convergence itself does not require living participants. Needing them was a feature of the preparatory phase, not of this one. Consider what that means. The horror of the outbreak, every corridor, every vent, every moment of scrambling survival through the Ishimura and the sprawl, all of that was the preparatory phase. From the universe's perspective, the terrifying part was manufacturing. Birth itself is almost quiet, specifically. That is the framing I want to hold for the rest of this chapter, because the biological language is precise rather than metaphorical. What the marker produces across the course of an outbreak is something that functions like a pregnancy. The marker seeds the environment. Infection spreads through the available biological material. The hive mind develops and begins coordinating, and the mass of assembled dead accumulates until it reaches the threshold the marker has been measuring toward. At that point, the event occurs that converts all that accumulated material into a new organism, and the new organism joins the larger community of similar organisms. Reproduction, specifically a form of reproduction that uses a host species the way certain parasitoid organisms use their hosts in nature, not a parasite in the strict sense, which feeds on the host and survives. Parasitoid organisms use the host's body as the site of their own reproduction and exit as something new. The host does not survive the process, because survival was never part of the arrangement. Research into parasitoid biology has documented this pattern across dozens of species, and the thing that researchers consistently find unsettling is the precision of it. The host is not incidentally destroyed, it is specifically converted. Every phase of the infection is tuned to maximize the productivity of the host as a reproductive medium, and the death is not a side effect of something the parasite does carelessly. The death is a design requirement. Dead Space places that mechanism at civilizational scale. Here the host is not a single organism. Every living thing on a planet fills that role simultaneously, and the exit is a moon. Let me pull back to Tau Volantis specifically, because that planet represents something unique in the franchise. It is the only place in the story where the host species actually prepared. The aliens of Tau Volantis went through the same sequence. They found a black marker. Presumably under the marker's influence, they built copies, spreading the signal across their world. An outbreak followed. The hive mind of their world coordinated their dead the way the Aegis 7 hive mind would later coordinate humanity's, and convergence began. Their corpses and the fragments of their planet rose toward the sky, and then, at the last possible moment, the machine activated. The machine is extraordinary in the context of this series, because almost everything in the franchise demonstrates that there is no stopping the process. Markers that are destroyed tend to have already done their work. Outbreaks that are contained tend to not stay contained. Hive minds that are killed do not end the infection that produced them. The entire franchise is constructed around the feeling of a process that cannot be interrupted, so that when something finally does interrupt it, the fact of interruption lands as genuinely shocking. And then one did. More than halting the event, the machine was designed to destroy the moon by crashing it into the planet, though the civilization that built it was consumed before they could finish configuring it for that purpose. What they did succeed in doing was freezing the event midway, holding the half-formed moon in a state of suspension above the planet for what the lore indicates was an enormous length of time, half-formed, and still broadcasting. This is the detail that makes the Tau Volantis moon a singular piece of writing within the franchise. An incomplete organism, frozen in mid-birth, still producing the signal that animates necromorphs, still reaching out to the network of other moons across the galaxy, still calling for someone to come and turn off the machine that is keeping it from finishing what it started. The message it sent was encoded in the marker signal, which means that everyone who heard it experienced it as a compulsion or a hallucination, which means that from the receiver side the call to go to Tau Volantis felt exactly like every other marker-induced drive they had ever experienced. People went. For a very long time, apparently, people went. Jacob Danik went because he believed that completing the convergence was the fulfillment of everything unitology had always promised. The details of his reasoning are important enough that they get their own chapter, but the relevant point here is what he actually did. He deactivated the machine, removing the one thing standing between a process already in progress and its conclusion, and the convergence that the alien civilization had stopped, at enormous cost, for an incomprehensible duration, resumed where it had left off. The moon began to finish being born. What Isaac and Carver did next was reconfigure the machine for what the aliens had originally intended it to do, completing a second act of interrupted engineering by a second species working from the same alien blueprint. The pulse fired, the moon was destroyed, its impact was enormous, and the victory lasted approximately long enough for Isaac to say Ellie's name twice before the vision arrived, showing the rest of the network fully awake and coming. There is an asymmetry in that ending worth naming plainly. The Tau Volantis civilization spent the resources of an entire world to slow the process down. Isaac Clarke spent 30 or 40 hours of subjective time to finish what they started. Both acts of resistance cost everything either party had available to spend. Twice this moon was stopped. The network had not even noticed until the dying moon made its phone call. That asymmetry is the actual scale of what Dead Space 3 is trying to communicate, and most players appropriately experience it as a gut punch. You did the impossible thing. The unstoppable thing was stopped. And somewhere across the galaxy, several other versions of that same thing woke up and started moving in your direction. The lesson the franchise appears to be delivering, chapter by chapter across its runtime, is that scale has a quality. Something large enough does not need to be clever, or fast, or even aware of you specifically. It simply has to exist across enough territory that every act of resistance, however heroic, happens inside an area it can afford to lose. The Brethren moons are that scale. Before we leave the Tau Volantis convergence entirely, there is one more thread worth pulling. That alien civilization left something behind besides the machine. What they left behind was a record, a library of information about what they had discovered and what they had done, encoded and distributed across the planet in logs that Isaac and Carver spend the third game piecing together. Those logs describe a species that went through every phase this series describes and understood what was happening to them. They understood the marker, the signal, and what building copies of it was doing to their population, and they built them anyway, apparently because the same energy imperative that drives human civilization drove theirs. Seeing the outbreak coming did not give them the power to stop it, so they built a machine to stop what they could not prevent. There is something quietly devastating about that sequence. These were not naive primitives who encountered the marker without context. They were, by all available evidence, a sophisticated civilization capable of constructing planetary-scale machinery and encoding detailed scientific records in durable formats. Understanding the process did not save them. Building countermeasures did not save them. What they managed, at the very end, at the cost of their entire civilization's remaining capacity, was a delay. Isaac Clarke arrives at that delay roughly 60 to 70 million years later and completes the job they started. Two species, separated by tens of millions of years, working on the same problem with the same technology, trying to stop the same organism, each nearly destroyed by the attempt, each succeeding in stopping the moon once, and only once. The lore does not tell us whether any third species on any other world ever found that machine and finished it before Danik did the opposite. It gives us a silence on that question, the same productive silence it gives us about the first moon's origin that functions as an answer of its own. If anyone had stopped the process permanently, the network would not have been intact and awake when the Tau Volantis moon called. No civilization in the franchise's lore ever has. Keep that in mind as we go into the next section, because the game has been putting you inside the logic of this process since the first minute, and it did it with something you probably never thought to analyze. Chapter 4. The body is not the point. There is a moment in the first Dead Space game where something needs to be explained, and nobody is around to explain it. You have just encountered your first slasher, and you have shot it, and it has not gone down. This is confusing. The thing in front of you was a person 3 days ago, and shooting a person is supposed to work, so you shoot it again, and it does not go down again, and then it reaches you, and the tutorial text appears. Aim for the limbs. That instruction is the game's most important design decision, and almost nobody who remembers it thinks of it as a lore statement. Most people think of it as a survival tip, a change in aim point, a tactical adjustment that makes the combat more interesting. All of those readings are accurate. None of them is the deepest version of what the mechanic is doing. Strategic dismemberment is the game explaining the marker's logic back to you through your hands. Let me build that slowly, because it is a specific claim and it requires a specific foundation. Start with why headshots do not work, because the reason is interesting and the game's answer to it is not the obvious one. Animation does not come from its own brain. The marker signal reaches into the tissue and drives movement directly, which means the brain inside that reconstructed skull is not operating the body below it. Signal drives structure, not biology. Destroying the brain removes a vestigial organ, the biological equivalent of shooting off someone's hair. The body keeps moving because the body was never taking orders from the brain in the first place. Where the signal does have to interface with the physical structure is at the joints. This is where the muscular cells have reorganized into dense bundles, and those bundles carry the necrotic tissue that keeps the reanimated structure functioning. Cut off a limb, and those bundles are severed from the signal pathway. The body cannot sustain the animation without enough of the network intact, and so it stops. Not because you destroyed a control center, because you drained the fuel. Now hold both of those facts side by side. The brain does not matter. Where the vulnerability sits is at the joints. What you are being told, through mechanics, is that these bodies have been reorganized around a different logic than human anatomy. The parts that human anatomy centers, the head, the torso, the vital organs in the chest, are not where the new system depends. What carries the weight now is the connections between parts, the joints, the articulations, the points where one section of the body transitions into another. That is where the infection concentrates its investment. Think about what that describes. Something has taken a human body and redesigned it around a principle that has nothing to do with how a human body was originally organized, and the redesign has moved the vulnerability to the outside rather than the center. The core is now decorative. Load-bearing functions have moved to the edges. This is the marker's relationship to matter in miniature. The marker takes what exists and converts it toward a specification that has nothing to do with the original organism's purposes or priorities. Preserving function is not part of the process. Respecting the original structure is not part of it either. What it is doing is extracting material and reassembling it around its own design requirements. A necromorph is not a corrupted human. What the human became is inventory, converted into something the process finds more useful. And the game teaches you to think the same way. Every combat encounter in Dead Space is a rapid assessment of a body as a collection of structural components. You look at the slasher and you do not see a person. Seeing a person would cause you to aim for the center mass. And center mass is where this thing is least vulnerable. What you are supposed to see is a set of limbs with known vulnerabilities at known connection points, and your job is to sever the relevant connections in the most efficient order. The plasma cutter rotates. That detail is worth dwelling on for a moment. The primary weapon of the entire franchise is a precision cutting tool that can be oriented either horizontally or vertically, and the choice between orientations is determined entirely by which limb geometry you are trying to sever. You switch from horizontal to vertical, not because the enemy is more dangerous, but because the anatomy has changed, because this body is assembled differently from the last one, and you need to read the assembly before you cut. That is how the marker reads the organisms it encounters. as assemblies, matter organized in a particular configuration, available to be taken apart and reorganized in a different one. By the time you are fluent at Dead Space combat, you have been trained to look at a human body and see the joints first. Threat assessment becomes a question of what is connected to what, and which connections need to go first. Enough time inside the system makes the system's own logic your working language for everything in front of you. Horror games manipulate player psychology in a wide variety of ways, but most of them work through withholding information, through darkness, through the threat of unknown things in unknown spaces. Dead Space does something stranger. It teaches you a way of seeing, and then reveals that the thing you have been taught to see is the way the enemy sees everything. The enemy is not wrong, which is the disturbing part. Dismemberment works. Reading bodies as assemblages of parts works. The logic functions because it is real, and the reason it is real is that bodies actually are assemblages of parts, and the fact that humans do not normally think about them that way is a cultural decision rather than a biological one. Some traditions of thought have made exactly that point in non-horror contexts. The practice of certain medical and scientific disciplines requires looking at the body as a set of systems, none of which is specially sacred, any of which can be isolated and examined and modified. This is a useful way of thinking for surgery. Physiology benefits from it as well. Pressed to its extreme, this orientation produces some of the most important insights in the history of medicine. And it is also a way of thinking that if it becomes the default orientation toward other people rather than a professional tool, starts to produce something closer to the marker's view of the universe. The marker lives at that extreme. For the marker, every organism is a resource in one configuration or another. Living, it is a builder. Dead, it is construction material. There is no intermediate category, no threshold below which a thing stops being usable. The process has a relationship with matter that is purely functional and perfectly consistent. Dismemberment as a mechanic is the game letting you live inside that relationship for the duration of a campaign, and then asking you to sit with what you have learned to do. Now, here is the detail that tends to be lost in discussions of this mechanic, and it matters for the thesis. The dismemberment does not kill. When you sever enough limbs from a necromorph, it collapses. It stops moving. The threat is neutralized, and in practical terms you treat it as dead and move on. But the marker signal continues to permeate the tissue. Cellular activity persists. The infection remains present and active in the mass of immobilized material on the floor. If that material were given time and the right conditions, the process would continue reorganizing it. What you have done in mechanical terms is not eliminate the threat from the world. You have eliminated the threat from your immediate path. The material remains material, the signal remains in it, and the process has not been interrupted, only locally paused. That small fact is a microcosm of the entire franchise. The Ishimura outbreak is contained in the first game, and the second opens on a second outbreak on a station that was specifically studying the first one. Isaac's destruction of the Titan station marker stops that event, but the third game opens with markers proliferating across human space because the institutional momentum behind them was never stopped, only inconvenienced. Killing the Tau Volantis moon stops the awakening of the rest of the network. Your bullets are real. The stasis module works. Everything in your arsenal does exactly what it says it does, and none of it is enough to interrupt the process, only to navigate through a small piece of it. Think about the enemies that dismemberment does not stop at all. The hunter, encountered in the first game, is a necromorph that has been specifically augmented with regenerative capability. Limbs severed from it grow back. Every combat vocabulary developed to this point stops working against it. The only options are to temporarily immobilize it and run, or to destroy the tissue so completely through environmental hazards that regeneration becomes impossible. Later installments return this architecture in different forms, and each time it surfaces, what surfaces with it is the reminder that the weakness you learned is not a fundamental property of the enemy. It is a feature of the most common configuration. The underlying process can produce variants that patch the vulnerability entirely. which means that every set of tactics you have carefully developed could become obsolete the moment you encounter a form the process has tuned against those specific tactics. This is how biological arms races work in nature, and it is worth noting that real research into host-parasite dynamics has found exactly this pattern. The host species develops defenses, parasites evolve around them, update the defenses, and the parasite updates faster because its reproductive cycle is shorter and the selection pressure is constant. Hosts are always responding to what the parasite was doing last cycle. Parasites are always already doing something different. Dead Space gives you this problem in real time across a 3-game arc. There is also the psychological dimension of this, which tends to go unexamined in discussions of horror game design. Shooting a necromorph in the head feels like it should work. No tutorial explains why it does not work before you try it. That encounter is designed so that you arrive with the instincts every other game has trained into you. You apply them, and they fail. Failure is not punishing enough to end the run, but it is embarrassing in a specific way. You did the obvious thing, the thing that decades of zombie fiction told you was correct, and the creature did not notice. What the game is doing in that moment is invalidating your inherited model of how this enemy works. The model you arrived with assumes that what you are fighting is, at some level, still organized around the priorities of a living human body. Protect the head because the head contains the control system. Shoot for the chest because the chest contains the vital organs. The organism in front of you has been reorganized past those assumptions, and your first job as a player is to unlearn everything you brought in with you and replace it with something derived from direct observation. Horror games often use darkness and limited information to generate fear. Dead Space does something different. It generates fear by making you competent with the wrong model and then methodically demonstrating that the model is wrong. The terror here is not that you cannot see. Seeing perfectly clearly does not fix the problem, because you are still operating with a framework the enemy has moved past. By the midpoint of the first game, you have rebuilt your model. You see a slasher and you see its arms, and you cut the arms and it goes down, and you have solved the puzzle. What the game is quietly doing in the background is making sure you feel the satisfaction of that competence, because competent players tend to forget to be afraid, and forgetting to be afraid is exactly the psychological state the franchise needs you in when it introduces forms that patch the vulnerability you learned. The Hunter is not a harder enemy in the conventional sense. It is a direct attack on the model you just built. Everything you learned, everything you practiced, everything you got good at, does not work on this thing. Limbs come off and grow back. The dismemberment that made you feel capable now makes you feel panicked, because capable was the assumption the game needed to challenge before it could generate real fear again. This is the third layer of what dismemberment is doing as a design decision. The first layer is practical. Aim for limbs, it works, they go down. The second layer is philosophical. Reading a body as an assemblage of parts is the marker's logic, and by practicing it, you are thinking with the marker. The third layer is the reset. When you encounter a form that the model does not fit, the comfortable competence dissolves, and the original fear comes back not as panic, but as something quieter and more lasting. Recognition arrives that whatever pattern you have identified, whatever weakness you have located and exploited, the process is already capable of producing a form that does not share it. What you are learning across the entire franchise is not how to kill necromorphs. You are learning how the process works. And the process, once you understand it well enough, is what becomes frightening, because processes do not have exploitable weaknesses. Processes just run. There is a wrinkle waiting that connects this chapter to what comes next, and I want to plant it here rather than save it. Unitology believes in convergence, not as a mechanism, not as a biological process, but as a destination, as a rival, as the word that justifies everything that preceded it. By the time we get to the church in detail, you will understand that the believers were not experiencing an abstract theology. They were receiving the signal. The signal they received was real, an experience of something coming from outside, something large and purposeful and aimed at them, Something that spoke in a voice that felt more real than their own thoughts, was not fabricated. The source was the marker. It was always the marker, and nothing about that fact comforts anyone. And the question of whether a signal that is genuinely real can be genuinely worshipped, and whether worship changes what the signal is doing to you, is the most uncomfortable question this series ever asks. We are going to spend the next chapter finding out what unitology actually knew, what it actually taught, and what happened when a man decided that completing the convergence was an act of faith. The answer is going to reframe the fight on Tau Volantis in a way that makes Isaac Clarke look, briefly, like the villain of the story. Chapter 5. The Religion That Got Everything Right. There is a gift shop inside the Titan Station Church of Unitology. Miniature replicas of the Black Marker, statues of figures in golden masks, which the church calls the Enigmas, and the masks themselves for sale, with a placard near the register asking what truth you might see in them, what truth they might see in you. That detail is easy to read as satire, as the game poking fun at institutional religion, at the commercialization of belief, at the way a genuinely felt spiritual impulse can get a price tag attached to it without anyone in the building seeming to notice. The satire is there, and it is pointed, but stopping at satire misses the more disturbing thing the Church of Unitology is doing in this story. This is a religion whose central theology is correct, not approximately correct, not metaphorically correct, not correct in the way that a poem about the ocean is correct about the feeling of being small. Unitology's core claim about what the markers are and what convergence does is accurate to the observable facts of the universe those believers inhabit. They are right about everything except what being right means for them, and that gap between accurate belief and catastrophic consequence is the thing this chapter is going to examine. Start with Altman. Michael Altman was a geophysicist who became involved with the research team excavating the black marker from the Chicxulub crater in the year 2014. The discovery of an alien object of obvious age and apparent technological sophistication was being managed as a government secret, and the official policy was to keep the marker's existence entirely classified. Altman disagreed with that policy. Believing the discovery belonged to the public record, he made it one, releasing footage and information about the black marker against the wishes of the institution he worked inside. Altman had also understood what the marker was doing. Research into its effects had made clear that the object was dangerous, that exposure was producing measurable changes in the people around it, and that the energy it seemed to offer came attached to consequences that had nothing to do with power generation. He tried to stop EarthGov from moving forward with the marker program, and at one point reverse-engineered enough of the marker's signal to calm its output during an outbreak. When that failed to halt the program, he destroyed the facility, attempting to ensure that nobody would find the object again. Days after going public with his findings, Altman turned up dead. What followed is one of the more quietly devastating pieces of writing in the Dead Space universe, because the story of how unitology was actually founded almost never gets told. Two military officers overseeing the Black Marker facility, named Stevens and Markoff, killed Altman before the full consequences of the Black Marker's existence could be properly understood by anyone outside their circle. Then they did something that most people who play these games never fully register. Before killing him, they had already copied the marker code and signal Altman had used to stabilize the outbreak. And after killing him, they built a religion using his death as the founding myth. They presented Altman as a martyr, a geophysicist who had tried to reveal the truth and been killed for it by the government, which is accurate as far as it goes, and they published books in his name, which is not. They presented themselves as his acolytes, faithful students preserving the teachings of a man they had murdered. The public, already outraged by the government's violent suppression of a scientist who had tried to give the world an important discovery, responded exactly the way outrage and grief tend to respond. It grew. Unitology grew faster than any religion previously recorded in that world's history, and the timing of its emergence matters enormously. The franchise is set in a future that is visually and thematically defined by resource exhaustion and corporate consolidation. Planets are being cracked open for their minerals. People are living in corporate-owned habitats on moons and stations, in conditions that the surrounding physical environment makes clear are not generous. Into that specific social moment, a religion arrived that promised exactly what the moment needed someone to promise. Death is not the end. Humanity was created by a higher intelligence and carries a divine inheritance. Convergence, the great unification to come, will resolve the division and suffering of individual existence into something whole and imperishable. Every one of those promises speaks directly to a population scattered across the stars, separated from home, working in dangerous conditions for institutions that treat them as resources rather than as people. All of them address something the surrounding material world is conspicuously failing to provide, and all of them in the unitology framing are supported by a physical artifact. You can look at the marker, study its signal, take its energy readings. A faith asking you to believe in the invisible would be easier to dismiss. What unitology hands you instead is something you can point a measuring device at. Large donations were required to advance within the church hierarchy. This is where the gift shop becomes something other than satire. The ranking system that converts credits into spiritual advancement is not a quirk of unitology. It is the institutional structure that explains how an organization with billions of followers across human space maintained operational discipline. Every rank purchased is a commitment made not just in belief, but in material resources. And every resource transferred to the church is a resource no longer available to fund doubt. The structure ties the believer's financial well-being to the church's continued viability, which means leaving becomes increasingly expensive the further inside you go. Isaac Clarke hated unitology specifically because of this mechanism. His mother spent the family's resources climbing the church hierarchy, which is the kind of specific personal damage that makes abstract institutional critique feel like something. For Isaac, the church was not a philosophical error. It was what happened to his family when his mother's conviction, amplified by the signal she was almost certainly receiving without understanding what it was, consumed everything material that held their household together. Now here is the piece that requires the most careful handling. There is an irony sitting at the center of the Altman story that the franchise never resolves and never tries to. Altman's actual position on the marker was that it was dangerous and should not be used, that the government should be transparent about its existence, precisely so that the public could understand the risk, and that the energy program built around it was a catastrophic mistake in the making. Divine purpose was not part of his framing. Convergence was not a destination he considered worth seeking. Publishing information about the black marker was an act aimed at making the problem visible, because concealment was making it worse. The church built in his name teaches everything he opposed. Every unitologist who prays to Altman as the chosen of the marker, as the architect of the church, as the way and the light, is venerating a man whose actual beliefs were the precise opposite of what they are venerating him for holding. Stevens and Markoff took a scientist who said this object is dangerous and built a theology around the claim that he said this object is sacred, and did it so successfully that within a few generations the original position had been completely overwritten. Research into how religious and national founding stories evolve over time has found that the gap between what founders actually said and what later generations believe they said tends to widen proportionally with the reverence they receive. The more sacred the founder, the more completely the historical figure gets replaced by the symbolic one. Altman, the geophysicist, who wanted to contain a dangerous artifact, became Altman the prophet, who was martyred for revealing a sacred truth. Both descriptions of his death contain some of the same facts. The meanings attached to those facts are complete opposites. What the Dead Space writers did with this was embedded in the gameplay environment rather than in the narrative dialogue. Reading unitologist logs, you observe how the theology functions. Walking through the church on the sprawl, you see the architecture, the statues, the gift shop, the worshippers on their knees. Fighting past circle soldiers whose suits are covered in marker symbols is what the gameplay makes of it. And nowhere in any of that does anyone say what you are now holding in your mind, that the man those symbols represent would have told every single one of them to stop. The horror of unitology is not that it is a lie. Parts of it are true, in the terrible way we have established. The horror is that the parts that are true got there through an institutional process that stripped out the only man who understood the danger and replaced him with a version of himself that endorsed it. Keep that in mind when we get to Danik, because Danik is doing something specific with Altman's legacy that distinguishes him from ordinary institutional unitology. The people who built the church, unitology's founders, were not simply cynical fraudsters exploiting grief. Both men had witnessed the outbreak at the Black Marker site and knew what necromorphs were. Having observed what the marker's signal produced in people exposed to it, they formed their own interpretation. Both believed the necromorphs produced by the Black Marker were defective, a flawed output from a damaged artifact rather than the intended result of what the markers were supposed to do. Their theory was that a new marker, or the right marker, would produce convergence in its true form, a genuine unification of humanity into something higher. Read that carefully. What they invented was a theology based on the observation that the markers produce a transformation in living and dead matter, and on the further hypothesis that the transformation they witnessed was a corrupted version of a better process. Wrong about the corruption, wrong about the intention, and wrong about what the better process would look like. But they were working from data. The data was real, the conclusions were their own, and the conclusions killed everything they touched. This makes unitology something horror rarely attempts. The closest comparable theological error in science fiction horror is the worshippers in Lovecraft's cycle, who reach out to the deep gods, but those cults are typically written as pathological, as people for whom the call of the inhuman fills something broken in them. Unitology has billions of followers, which means it is filling something ordinary. It is offering what every religion that sustains a large population offers, a framework for death, a community of shared conviction, and a promise that the suffering of the present is not the last word. The tragedy is that the signal filling them with conviction was the marker, and the marker's promise is technically kept, made whole, unified with the rest of your species, becoming part of something that does not die. The moon does not lie. What it offers is exactly what it says. The misunderstanding the believers carry is not about the destination. It is about who gets to be conscious when they arrive. Now look at Danik, because Danik represents what the theology produces when it reaches its logical endpoint in one human being. Jacob Danik led the Circle, the militant arm of unitology, funded by the church's accumulated resources, freeing the markers from institutional suppression. In his view, meant allowing a divine process to complete itself, removing the only obstacle between humanity and its intended destiny. Watching the government contain outbreaks, study the markers as weapons and power sources, and treat the signal as a security threat to be managed, he read all of that as profound sacrilege. When Danik reached the machine on Tau Volantis and understood what it was doing to the moon above the planet, his response was entirely consistent with everything he had ever believed. He was looking at a device that was keeping the fulfillment of humanity's divine purpose in a state of suspended incompletion. Removing it was not violence. From inside the theology that had shaped his entire life, removing it was the most righteous act available to him. Correct about what the machine was doing. Correct that deactivating it would allow the moon to complete its formation, and correct that convergence would follow. Wrong about exactly one thing, and it was the thing everything else rested on. Danik believed the moon was the divine embodiment of the marker's will, a being of transcendent purpose, whose completion would elevate humanity to its intended form. What the moon was, in fact, was a necromorph, a very large one that had described itself as a god in the signal it was transmitting, which is the precise category of evidence a devout unitologist would find most convincing. Here is the moment where the script I promised you arrives. Consider the position Isaac Clarke occupies on Tau Volantis from inside the theology. Isaac Clarke is a man who has spent 3 games destroying markers, beginning with the one on Aegis 7, then the Site 12 marker on the Ishimura, and the marker on the Sprawl, and arriving at Tau Volantis with the explicit purpose of finding and destroying whatever was generating the signal that had been calling to him across the stars. And when he found the machine, his goal was to complete it and turn it against the moon. Inside Danek's framework, and by extension the framework of every unitologist alive, Isaac Clarke is a mass destroyer of sacred objects who arrived at the single most important site in human history with a weapon aimed at the fulfillment of humanity's destiny. Clarke is not a hero fighting a monster from that position. Calling him a heretic attacking a god is the more precise description. The game knows this tension is real, and it does something with it. During the Tau Volantis sequence, Isaac experiences hallucinations instructing him to turn the machine off. The hallucinations are the marker signal, reaching into his neurology the way it has been doing since the first game, using the same mechanism it uses on everyone else. What is different this time is what the instruction says. The instruction is not asking him to build a copy or approach the object. What it is asking him to perform is exactly the action a devout unitologist would perform, the action that would allow the process to complete. For one specific window of time on Tau Volantis, Isaac Clarke is being hallucinated into agreement with Jacob Danek. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a small thing. The game is asking you to sit in the discomfort of a horror protagonist who, under the influence of the thing he is trying to destroy, was temporarily on the same side as the antagonist. It is not accusing Isaac of being wrong. Crashing the moon was the right call, and the game makes that clear. What it is doing is refusing to let the rightness of the call function as a complete vindication. Danek was acting on genuine conviction. The conviction was fed by a real signal from a real source, and that source was a necromorph. All of those things are simultaneously true, and none of them cancels the others. The survivors of the Circle who made it off Tau Volantis aboard the Terra Nova were then contacted by the awakened Brethren Moons directly. What happened to those survivors is the most honest version of where Unitology's theology leads. Some of them were driven mad by the contact. Others took their own lives. A small number remained, gathered around a new prophet who received the Moons' communications and interpreted them as revelation, and that remnant community began mutilating themselves to resemble necromorphs, cutting away what they called the body's imperfections and replacing them with metal and bone in honor of the moon's voice. The theology had arrived at its conclusion. What the signal had promised, unification of flesh, and the believers who heard it most clearly began implementing that promise themselves, ahead of schedule, with whatever tools they had available. A story about people being duped would be easier to process. What we have instead is a story about people receiving accurate information about a real phenomenon, interpreting it through the best framework available to them, and arriving at an outcome that demonstrates what the phenomenon always intended. The Moons wanted the flesh reorganized. They made that want available as a signal. Received as revelation, it was acted upon. The marker did not invent unitology. Human grief, human ambition, human institutional capacity, and 2 calculating men who saw a business opportunity in a dead man all invented unitology. But the marker made it inevitable, the way a current makes a certain course of travel inevitable for anything floating on it. The theology was built around the signal, and the signal was always going to produce this. If you are still here, the next section is where the last piece of the architecture clicks into place. We have built a complete picture of what unitology is and how it served the cycle. What we have not yet examined in full is the moon itself in its frozen state, specifically what it means for something this powerful and this purposeful to have been halted before completion, and what that incomplete existence implies about everything the frozen moon did while it waited. Chapter 6. The Shape of Something Unfinished. The Tau Volantis moon did not die when the machine activated. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that makes the entire Dead Space 3 story possible. What the machine did was freeze. The planet, the atmosphere, the entire surface environment of Tau Volantis was locked into a state of suspended cold, and the moon in mid-formation above it was locked along with it, held at the precise moment when it had accumulated enough biomass to begin but not enough to finish. A convergence event that had run to approximately whatever percentage of completion the alien civilization managed to buy with their final engineering effort stopped there and preserved. The question worth sitting with is what preserved means, in this context, for something like the moon. A frozen moon is not an inert moon. At its core, the marker did not stop transmitting when the temperature dropped. Transmission continued at whatever rate it always continues, which means the necromorphs on the planet's surface continued existing, continued hunting, continued waiting. 2 million years of necromorphs, preserved on a frozen planet along with the remains of the civilization that froze them, maintaining the outbreak that was supposed to feed a convergence that never quite happened. Consider what that represents in terms of waiting. Not the marker's geological patience, which we discussed earlier in the context of the 65 million years buried under the Yucatan. A different kind of waiting, because the moon was not dormant during those 2 million years the way the black marker was dormant. Broadcasting, waiting, still producing necromorphs from the corpses of its creators on a surface so cold that almost nothing biological could survive, because almost nothing biological is what it needed. It needed things that were already dead, and the dead on Tau Volantis had nowhere to go. Before we reach the weight of that reading, I want to stay with the 2 million year number for a moment, because it has a specific quality that the franchise deploys quietly and then moves past. 2 million years is roughly the span of time that separates the present from the first stone tools made by early human ancestors. It is a period longer than the entire genus Homo has existed. If you tried to explain to someone from 2 million years ago that their descendants would one day operate a machine built by an alien civilization on a frozen planet to stop a moon from being born, every word in that sentence, except perhaps water, would require translation into concepts that did not yet exist. The alien civilization of Tau Volantis froze that moon before any member of our genus had ever held a rock. And the moon was still there, still transmitting, still reaching outward through the marker signal toward any receiver capable of picking it up, which means it was broadcasting a call for help across interstellar distance for the entire history of human existence and far beyond it. People came. The franchise does not give us a complete record of everyone who received that signal and followed it to Tau Volantis, and I will not invent one. What the lore confirms is that the Sovereign Colony's armed forces arrived to investigate, and the SCAF research effort produced the codex and the knowledge of the machine at enormous human cost. Dr. Serrano, whose records Isaac and Carver pieced together across the third game, understood what the moon was and what the machine had stopped. The codex he created was specifically designed to interface with the machine, to give whoever operated it the ability to either free the moon or destroy it. Both options required someone to be present and understand the technology well enough to use it, and someone first had to survive long enough on a frozen necromorph-infested planet to reach the machine at all, which is not trivial when the planet's remaining necromorphs include the enormous form Dead Space 3 calls the Nexus. The Nexus on Tau Volantis is interesting for a specific reason. Built from the native alien species rather than from humans, its physical architecture differs from the hive minds produced by human outbreaks. 4 blades rather than the human-derived form's bladed profile. A different set of appendages, but the same essential structure, the same command role within the Horde, the same relationship to the marker's signal above it. The infection adapted to a different host species and produced a functionally equivalent result. That adaptability is worth pausing on, because it is something the games imply but never quite say directly. The Necromorph template is not species-specific. Running on a non-human biological substrate, the same underlying process produces a recognizable equivalent form. Hive mind is not a human category. It is a role the process fills, using whatever material is available. What you encounter on Tau Volantis is the alien civilization's version of what humanity's Aegis 7 produced, assembled from entirely different raw material, which means the process was not designed for humans specifically. Humanity is one input among many that the marker can work with, and the franchise had been implying this from the beginning, but Tau Volantis is where the implication becomes visible proof. Now look at what the moon was broadcasting for those 2 million years, because the content of the signal matters. Isaac Clarke arrives at Tau Volantis under the influence of a signal he has been receiving since the events of the first game. His neurological relationship with the marker, built up across contact with multiple artifacts across multiple outbreaks, has given him an unusual sensitivity to the transmission, and what that sensitivity is receiving as he approaches Tau Volantis is a set of instructions he experiences as hallucinations. The hallucinations are asking him to turn the machine off. Hold the structure of that manipulation for a second. Through the marker signal, the moon broadcasts into Isaac's neurology, encoding a message his pattern-sensitive brain decodes as voices and visions. That message is an instruction that would result in the moon's completion, and the instruction is framed as coming from within him, as the product of his own psychological state, as something his compromised mind is generating rather than receiving. He is being told, by the thing he is trying to destroy, to do the thing that would allow the thing to complete itself. From the previous chapter, recall that Danik received this instruction as revelation. The difference between Danik's experience and Isaac's is not in the signal, it is in the interpretive framework. Danik had a theology that told him an instruction to release the moon was divine. Isaac had enough exposure to the marker's manipulation to know that any internal voice telling him to perform an action that benefits the marker should be treated with extreme suspicion. The signal is the same. What changes the outcome is what the receiver brings to the table before the signal arrives. Something worth noticing about what the Tau Volantis sequence asks of Isaac's psychology before we look at what it asks of his mechanics. By Dead Space 3, Isaac has survived contact with more marker influence than any other human character in the franchise. The first game put him inside a marker-saturated outbreak for its entire duration, and the second placed him in direct contact with a fully active marker on the sprawl, requiring him to fight his way through his own hallucinations to destroy it. Both experiences left marks that the third game inherits. Nicole still appears in his vision. Things in the signal still reach him. The marker's pattern is embedded in his neurology at a depth most characters in this universe never approach. That depth is what makes him both useful and vulnerable on Tau Volantis. He can read marker script and interface with marker-derived technology in ways other characters cannot, which positions him uniquely to reconstruct the codex and operate the machine. The neurological history gives him a kind of fluency developed at enormous personal cost, and that fluency is exactly what makes him the right person to complete the alien civilization's work, and it makes him the right person to be manipulated by the moon's signal. For exactly the same reason, someone with no exposure to the signal might not receive the hallucinations at all, or might receive them without the urgency and apparent reality that makes them dangerous. Average exposure might produce compulsive thoughts without their source being apparent. Isaac receives them with the vividness and immediacy of direct sensory experience, because his brain has spent 2 full games being trained to take the signal seriously as a source of real information. The moon is not using a vulnerability, it is using a strength. Isaac's capacity to work with the marker's signal is the same capacity that makes him susceptible to the marker's manipulation, and the game puts you in the position of navigating that paradox without resolving it. Needing to be what he is to do the job, and what he is makes him the thing the enemy most wants to reach. There is real scholarship in the field of psychology around how prior belief structures determine what information we absorb from ambiguous signals, and the mechanism it describes is not limited to religious conviction. Any strong framework, secular or otherwise, functions as a filter on incoming experience, sorting signals into categories the framework already recognizes, amplifying the ones that fit, and frequently dismissing the ones that do not. The marker's signal is not ambiguous in any normal sense. It is a sophisticated transmission that seems to know how to address its receiver, but the receiver's prior framework still determines whether that transmission is experienced as instruction from within or communication from without. Danik had no framework that could produce the second interpretation. Let me pull back to the physical moon itself, because there is a quality to its incomplete state that the narrative of Dead Space 3 is doing something specific with, and I want to name it. Most horror monsters are either complete or obviously diminished. The full form of the threat is the reference point, and the story either presents it at full power, as in the Brethren Moon at the end of the Awakened DLC, or it presents a weakened version and gradually escalates toward the full form. Structurally, the Tau Volantis moon is neither of those things. It is a thing in the middle of becoming. Formation had progressed past the threshold where it could be reversed, but had not reached the threshold where it was self-sustaining without the marker's continued involvement. The flesh at the core had begun fusing, but not finished. Planetary crust forming the outer shell was in place, though the organism beneath had not finished integrating it, and the marker inside was broadcasting without the moon having developed into an entity capable of transmitting independently at full power. What you are looking at when the Tau Volantis moon descends toward the surface is a birth interrupted at an advanced stage of labor, and the thing about birth is that it cannot stay interrupted indefinitely. Biological processes that have passed the point of initiation do not simply wait for convenient timing. They continue, and if they cannot continue in the intended direction, they create pressure that builds until something either releases it in the intended direction or ruptures something trying to hold it back. The machine was holding back something that had been building pressure for 2 million years. Danik released it. The pressure did not gradually ease out, it completed almost instantly. The moon that had been frozen in mid-formation descended. The ground tore away, and the entire suppressed process ran forward in a matter of minutes. There is a parallel available from a completely different domain of science that is worth borrowing. When certain geological pressures are released after extended periods of compression, the release is not proportional to the force applied. It is explosive, because what you are releasing is not the current pressure alone, but the accumulated energy of however long the compression was sustained. 2 million years of suspended convergence did not produce a gradual resumption of the birth process. It produced something that completed itself in what appears to be under an hour. Isaac and Carver went into the heart of the machine while that resumption was happening. What the machine could do, once they reconfigured it using the codex, was not stop the moon's descent but redirect the machine's original purpose, which the alien civilization had always intended as destruction rather than preservation. The crash that followed was the machine completing the second half of what its builders had meant it to do, the half they never lived long enough to implement. Now look at the aftermath from a specific angle, because the crash of the Tau Volantis moon is not the end of anything. It is a transmission. A completed moon calling from across the galaxy would have announced itself clearly. What a dying moon in the process of being destroyed could send was something more compressed. The moon managed to contact its brethren before it finished. That contact sent no detailed account of what had happened on Tau Volantis. What it sent was the equivalent of a location and a status, enough for the network to know that something had been detected in this star system and was worth investigating. The Brethren moons that began moving toward Earth at the end of Dead Space 3 were not responding to a summons. They were responding to an anomaly. Something in their network had gone silent, where it had been transmitting for 2 million years. In the language of a distributed network, that silence is a signal of its own. Investigate, confirm, and if something destroyed a node, respond accordingly. From the moon's perspective, the events of Dead Space 3 look like this. A long dormant but transmitting node of the network, one held in suppressed state by alien intervention for 2 million years, briefly resumed and then went dark. The last transmission before the silence indicated the resumption had been disrupted by action rather than simply failed. Somewhere near that system, something capable of disrupting a convergence event exists. That is a very different threat calculation than the franchise had previously established. The moons are not simply moving toward Earth because Isaac is there. They are moving toward the star system where a node was lost. For the same reason any distributed system investigates a lost node, because the integrity of the network depends on understanding what can disrupt it. Think about the weight of that reading. Before we reach it fully, stay with the 2 million-year engineering sequence for a moment, because Dr. Serrano matters as a human figure in ways that tend to get overlooked. Serrano arrived at Tau Volantis 200 years before Isaac, at enormous cost to the Sovereign Colony's research mission, and understood clearly what the moon was and what the machine had stopped. Building the codex, he created the key that would eventually let someone operate the machine, and he transmitted it as far towards safety as he could manage before his mission fell apart. 200 years after that, Isaac used it, 3 separate moments in time. 3 separate representatives of different situations, all working on the same problem from different starting points. The alien civilization working without enough time left to finish. Serrano working with more understanding than resources. Isaac working with the resources of someone who has already lost most of what he cared about. None of them solved the problem. Each of them moved the solution 1 generation forward. This reframes Isaac's victory, and it does so in a way the Awakened DLC leans into explicitly. Surviving the crash of the moon, and waking on Tau Volantis' surface, Isaac and Carver are shown visions of the other moons approaching. The game's ambiguous ending leaves their survival thereafter unclear. What is clear is that the moons are coming, and they are coming with full awareness that something on this end destroyed one of their own. Everything the alien civilization built was aimed at buying time. Building the machine specifically to stop the moon, knowing they would not survive long enough to use it, the alien civilization left the records that eventually led Isaac to the Codex, and preserved, at the cost of their entire species, the one tool that could complete what they started. And what that tool, in the hands of the species that found it 2 million years later, accomplished was the certain knowledge of those species' existence, delivered directly to a galactic network of planet-eating organisms. That civilization died to keep the moons from knowing where intelligent life was waiting. And the act that seemed to fulfill their work was precisely the act that undid their secrecy. Humanity is that species, finding the records the aliens left, using the tool they built, doing with it exactly what the machine's own logic demanded, crashing the moon the way the machine was always supposed to, and in doing so informing the rest of the network that something capable of doing that was alive in this part of the galaxy. Whether that is a tragedy or a story still in progress depends entirely on what we do next. The franchise, as of the events in the Awakened DLC, leaves that question open. Awake and moving, the moons are coming. The machine may still be functioning on Tau Volantis. Earth does not yet know what is approaching. And somewhere on the surface of a frozen planet, 2 men woke up from an impossible fall and were shown a vision that made the size of the remaining problem perfectly clear. One of them is Isaac Clarke, a man who has stopped 3 outbreaks, survived 3 hive minds, destroyed 3 markers, and crashed a moon, and whom the marker has tried to kill, manipulate, and use across the entire franchise, and failed every time. The question the next section will ask is whether any of that constitutes a pattern that matters, or whether the sheer scale of what is coming makes the entire track record irrelevant. We are going to look at the moons one more time, from much further back, and ask whether the franchise was ever actually building toward a resolution, or whether the resolution was never the point. The answer connects directly to the question in the title of this video, and it requires one more piece of the puzzle before it fully comes into view. Chapter 7. When the God Speaks Back. The moons have a voice, not a metaphor, not an approximation, something that thinks of itself as a unified being, and that has been refining its ability to reach into the minds of other organisms for longer than our species has existed, can communicate directly into the neurology of whatever it wants to address. When it chooses to speak in language rather than compulsion, the language is precise. The dead moon had barely finished its call to the network before the network began to answer. And the answer arrived inside Isaac Clarke's mind. Let me establish what we know about how the moons communicate before we look at what they said, because the mechanism matters. The primary channel is the marker signal. Everything that travels through that network, every compulsion, every hallucination, every whisper telling someone to make us whole or turn it off, originates with the moons themselves and moves down through the chain. Moons to markers to the individuals whose neurology the markers have already sensitized. This is not a broadcast in the way a radio broadcast works, where everyone in range receives it equally. Targeted, it finds receivers who can process it, and among those receivers, it locates the ones most capable of acting on what it delivers. By the events of the awakened DLC, Isaac and Carver are the two human beings on or near Tau Volantis who are most capable of acting on anything. The network had just lost a node. Something on the surface of that planet had demonstrated the ability to disrupt a convergence event. Those two men are the most immediate relevant variables, and the moons reach into them accordingly. What the moons do on the Terra Nova is worth examining in detail because it demonstrates something about their intelligence that tends to get flattened into straightforward menace. Isaac, in the aftermath of the moon's crash, becomes increasingly convinced that installing the ship's shock point drive will lead the moons back to Earth. Carver becomes increasingly convinced that Isaac's paranoia is a symptom of his neurological deterioration from marker exposure, and that the only rational action is to use the drive immediately and warn the planet before the moons arrive. The two men begin to disagree, and the disagreement becomes a conflict, and the conflict eventually produces a hallucinated version of the fight, in which each man believes he is physically battling the other. All of that was arranged. When the hallucination resolves, and the moons speak directly, the content of what they say is the reveal. They had already known where Earth was. The argument they manufactured between Isaac and Carver was not to prevent them from warning the planet. It was to slow them down, to consume time, to keep two potentially disruptive variables occupied with each other, while the rest of the network closed the distance. Sit with the sophistication of that for a second. A distributed organism spanning the galaxy, ancient beyond useful measurement, reached individually into two specific human minds simultaneously, calibrated its manipulation to the specific psychological vulnerabilities and disagreements already present in those minds, amplified an existing tension into a manufactured crisis, extracted time from the situation, and then revealed it had done so only because revealing it was now costless. Something that can do that is not operating on the model of a monster that charges. It is operating on a model closer to what humans would recognize as strategy. Earth was the goal, not the two men specifically. Earth, which the moons already had access to via the markers seeded across human space, was already teeming with markers when Isaac and Carver arrived. That detail lands like a gut punch when you register it. Nothing in the moon's position required Isaac and Carver to lead them anywhere. Every red marker humanity built was a transmitter pointing at Earth, and there were many of them, and they had been running for generations. Humanity spent years building the infrastructure that made its own location obvious to something that was already looking. Now look at what the moons said, in the moment before they revealed themselves over Earth. From each world they devour, a new brother rises and is made whole. The network grows, and in this growing they will live forever. That framing contains a piece of information that does not get enough attention. New brothers from devoured worlds. Conquest is not the word. Destruction is not the word. Reproduction is. The language the moons use for what they do to civilizations is not the language of a predator describing prey. It is the language of a reproductive cycle describing its own perpetuation. They are describing themselves accurately, as we established in the first chapter. The horror of the accuracy has compounded by this point in the story. What they are saying is, the thing that is about to happen to your world is the same thing that makes us. You will become us. We were made the same way. Your ending is our beginning, and we find this natural and correct, because it has been natural and correct every time it has happened, across every world we have eaten, which is how we know we will live forever. Predators do not describe their prey as necessary. Humanity gets described as necessary in a precise and literal sense. What continues the moons requires what humanity can provide, and they articulate that requirement with a clarity that has no cruelty in it, which is itself a kind of cruelty far exceeding anything deliberate. When Isaac and Carver enter Earth's orbit and begin trying to reach someone, anyone on the surface, the responses they receive are not silence. The channels return signals, and the signals are necromorph sounds. Whatever communication infrastructure Earth operated was still functioning, and it was now populated by the outputs of a convergence event already underway. Rising from behind the planet's limb, their tentacles dragging across the surface, the moons complete in real time what the markers had been preparing since someone first found the black marker on Site 12 in the Yucatan. The designers were not being ambiguous with those words. Given what follows it, the most likely reading of that acronym is that Isaac and Carver, along with everyone else on or near Earth, did not survive the events the DLC concludes on. An image of Earth in the grip of what humanity spent centuries engineering ends the franchise, surrounding two people on a damaged ship trying to warn a world that is already past the point where warning helps. No sequel has resolved this. The remake restarts the story at the beginning, which is its own kind of comment on the cycle. We are still on the Ishimura, still finding out what a slasher is, still aiming for the limbs. There is something in that return to the beginning that will matter when we get to the final section. But first, let me stay in the Awakened DLC long enough to name something about the moon's behavior that tends to get glossed over in favor of the spectacle. The moons already knew where Earth was. That revealed at the end of the DLC as a kind of closing joke at Isaac and Carver's expense requires a moment's consideration. Knowledge of Earth's location was not derived from Isaac and Carver's route through shock space. Beforehand, the moons already had it. The most straightforward explanation, and the one most consistent with everything the franchise has established, is that the red markers seeded across human space were already providing the network with enough positional information to locate the planet of origin. Every marker copy humanity ever built was a signal pointing homeward. This retroactively changes the stakes of every marker-related event in the trilogy. The destruction of the marker on Aegis 7, the destruction of the marker on the Sprawl, the campaign against the markers on human-controlled worlds that Danik's Circle was conducting, all of it operated on the premise that the markers were the threat, and destroying them reduced the threat. What the ending reveals is that the threat had already been accomplished at the level of information. Active markers were not required for the moons to know where Earth was. That information had been transmitted long before Isaac started destroying anything, which means Isaac's entire arc across 3 games was, from the moon's perspective, taking place inside a parenthesis. The moons were hungry before Dead Space 1 began. They were going to arrive at Earth regardless of what happened on Aegis 7, regardless of what happened on the Sprawl, regardless of what Isaac did or did not do on Tau Volantis. The timeline of their arrival might have shifted, and the specific nature of the outbreak preceding their arrival might have changed. But the destination was already set when the first human being picked up a tool near a red marker and felt an idea that seemed like their own. Isaac's victories mattered. They mattered to the people whose lives they preserved, and to the specific outbreaks they contained, and as demonstrations of what a single determined human being can accomplish inside the system. Changing the system was beyond their reach. That is a genuinely difficult thing to hold. Most narrative structures for heroic protagonists assume that the protagonist's actions are consequential in a causal way, that what the hero does changes the outcome of the larger situation. Dead Space 3, and especially the Awakened DLC, is built around the idea that the protagonist's actions were consequential in the way that delaying a wave's arrival is consequential. The wave comes anyway. What mattered was who you pulled out of the way in the time you bought. Ellie got out. That is the only clearly positive outcome at the end of the base game. Ellie lives. Whether she survives whatever happened at Earth before Isaac and Carver arrived is left deliberately unclear, and the ambiguity is the point. Resolving whether any specific person made it is not what the story is interested in. The scale of what arrived at Earth makes individual survival beside the point of the question being asked. What the DLC is asking is what two people do when they understand that the warning they are racing to deliver is already too late, and one of them wants to destroy the tool that could get them there, and the other insists on using it anyway. Carver is right. Using the drive is the correct call. Isaac is also right that using the drive is almost certainly irrelevant to what they find. Both of them carry the weight of that correctly, and both of them install the drive anyway, because what else is there to do? The alternative is to stay on a frozen planet next to a dead moon and wait. That is not a heroic choice in the conventional sense. It is a human one. The franchise ends with people doing what people do when the situation is beyond the scale of what any person can address, which is to do the next available thing and keep moving. This is not triumph, it is persistence. And persistence, held in the right light, is also its own kind of answer to the question the moons implicitly pose. Before we can answer it fully, there is one more quality of the moons that needs to be named because it distinguishes them from every other kind of threat the franchise has presented. They cannot be negotiated with, not because they are mindless. Mindless is wrong. These entities think, plan, communicate, and manipulate with sophistication. The reason they cannot be negotiated with is that they have no need for anything humanity could offer as a trade. Negotiation requires that each party holds something the other party wants. Humanity holds biological material, which the moons want, and the moons hold the continuation of human existence, which humanity wants. That structure is not a negotiation. It is a situation with a predetermined direction. Every science fiction first contact scenario that ends in communication and coexistence involves a species that has something to gain from the arrangement. Trade, information exchange, mutual defense, the simple logistics of sharing a galaxy without conflict. The moons have nothing to gain from any of those arrangements. Their entire existence is built around the conversion of other species into more moons, and they have been doing this long enough that nothing a civilized species could offer would represent a sufficient alternative. The energy the markers seem to promise already belongs to them. Longevity, which unitology describes as the destination, is already theirs. Unity, the goal of every version of the convergence mythology, is already what they are. Nothing remains to trade for. From the moon's perspective, what unfolds is unremarkable, because nothing like it has ever interrupted the cycle before. The engineer and the soldier do it anyway, because remarkable was never the point. Getting somewhere while there was still time to get somewhere was the point. That small and human insistence is what the franchise, in its last exhale, is about. Chapter 8. We were never the point. Zoom out. Far enough that the Ishimura is not a ship in a corridor, but a dot in an arm of a galaxy, and the galaxy itself is not a horror setting, but one of hundreds of billions of similar structures, scattered across a universe so large that light from its edges has been traveling since before the planet Earth existed as anything other than gas and dust. Push the perspective that far, and the question the franchise is implicitly asking becomes visible in full. The universe is vast and old, and almost certainly not empty. Life, as far as everything we know about chemistry and stellar physics can tell us, is not a rare accident. The conditions that produce it occur with regularity across the cosmos, and the sheer number of planets that orbit stars in the habitable zone where liquid water can exist is large enough that even conservative estimates suggest billions of potential sites in this galaxy alone. Simple mathematics, applied to those numbers, says the universe should be full of life at various stages of development, and yet when we listen, we hear nothing. Scientists have had a name for this problem since the middle of the 20th century, and the problem has not resolved in the decades since it was named. Where is everyone? Signals, structures, artifacts, evidence that anybody out there ever figured out what we are still figuring out. None of it has arrived. That silence is so complete and so consistent that it cannot be explained by the limits of our instruments. Something explains it. The question is what? There are several categories of explanation, and they sort themselves into two rough groups based on where they place the barrier. One group says the silence exists because most of the potential sites for life never develop life in the first place. Chemistry is harder than we think. The window is narrower. The right conditions are less common than they seem. Life is rare. Intelligence is rarer. A mostly empty universe is one mostly incapable of generating what we are. Another group says the silence exists because something happens to intelligent civilizations before they get far enough to be noticed. Life may be common enough. Intelligence may develop with some regularity, but somewhere between developing fire and lighting the kind of beacon we could detect from across the galaxy, something ends the story for almost everything that tells it. This second explanation has a specific name, the Great Filter. A step exists on the path from chemistry to cosmic civilization that almost nothing passes through, and that step is the filter. Behind us, the filter might represent a hard obstacle humanity somehow cleared, while the universe stays quiet because almost everything else failed at an earlier stage. Or the filter might be ahead, meaning we are among the lucky things that made it to intelligence, and the thing waiting further along the road is what explains the silence. Dead space is one of the most literal depictions of a great filter in popular science fiction, and it is worth being specific about how it differs from the usual horror take on this concept. In most science fiction that engages with the filter, the mechanism is impersonal. Asteroids, runaway climate change, a technical threshold that civilizations cannot clear. The silence in those stories is the result of bad luck or bad design, the universe's indifference expressing itself through physics or ecology. Dead space gives the filter an organism. The silence in the dead space universe is not the result of civilizations failing to solve their own problems. It is the result of a process that arrives at the precise moment civilizations become capable of solving their problems and converts them into something else. The great filter in this fiction is alive, hungry, with a network spanning the galaxy, and running for long enough that the question of how old the first moon is has no satisfying answer, because there may be no recoverable record of a time before it. Now consider what this means for the problem of the universe's silence in the dead space setting. Where is everyone? Everyone became the moons. Every civilization that ever developed the technical capacity to build the things we would call evidence of civilization, the long-range communications, the large-scale structures, the interstellar ambitions, reached the point where they found a marker, or a marker found them. An energy crisis drove each toward the marker's apparent solution. Convergence converted their accumulated biomass into a moon, and each moon joined the network. So the filter sits inside the moment intelligence becomes useful, not ahead of it. This is the most unsettling version of the great filter hypothesis, because it removes the possibility of avoiding it through better choices. Knowing the mechanism did not provide an escape from the mechanism, as the Tau Volantis aliens demonstrated. What they managed was the delay we have already examined, bought at enormous cost, which may have been the thing that allowed humanity to exist long enough to be in this story at all. If the alien machine had not frozen the Tau Volantis moon for 2 million years, the moon's call to the network would have gone out 2 million years earlier. An alert would have gone out to the network 2 million years before humanity developed writing. Perhaps the moons would have arrived at Earth long before the Chicxulub asteroid, before the dinosaurs, before there was anything here to find. Whatever happened instead, the delay created by a dying alien civilization bought time for a species that could not yet have defended itself. They may have saved us without knowing we existed. There is a related set of ideas from outside the Great Filter framework that dead space inhabits without naming, and I want to spend a few paragraphs on it because it changes how the moon's behavior reads when you hold it in mind. Some theorists, thinking about the silence of the universe, have proposed that advanced civilizations go quiet deliberately. The logic is grim but coherent. If you know that other intelligent beings exist, and that contact with them might be dangerous, the safest strategy is to say nothing, to minimize your signal, to reduce your observable footprint as much as possible. A universe full of civilizations trying to hide from each other would look, from outside, exactly like a universe with no civilizations in it. Every civilization hides, because any civilization visible enough to be found is visible enough to be targeted. And in a universe where resource competition across interstellar distance is even theoretically possible, visibility is a liability. Dead Space does not use this model as its answer, but it uses it as a trap. Humanity in the franchise's future did not hide. Humanity expanded, broadcasting its existence, building markers and distributing them across populated space, and using the church that formed around them as a global organizational structure. In doing so, humanity became the most visible civilization imaginable, waiving its location as visibly as possible at the one category of observer for which visibility is fatal. The silence of the real universe might exist because everybody is hiding. Dead Space's universe is silent because everybody was found. Both models end in the same sound, which is no sound at all when you try to contact the rest of the galaxy. The difference is that one means there is still a galaxy of hidden civilizations out there, and the other means the galaxy is a resource management exercise conducted by things that were made from civilizations. Put those two models side by side, and what you are holding is the entire emotional range of the Great Filter question. Behind us, and the universe is waiting for us, ahead of us, and we are already inside it. Dead Space argues that it is both, simultaneously, and that the difference between the two positions depends entirely on when in your civilization's history you are asking. Which leaves us with the final and largest question the franchise ever asks, and answering it properly requires stepping back from the fiction entirely for a moment, because the answer lives in the space between what Dead Space invented and what actually worries scientists who think about this problem for a living. Now sit with the biological dimension of this, because the franchise is not simply engaging with astronomy when it builds the moons. It is engaging with a much older and more intimate field. Parasitoid biology, which we touched on briefly in Chapter 3, is worth expanding here because the Dead Space universe's version of the mechanism has features that real parasitoid organisms share in ways that are not accidental. The most sophisticated parasitoid systems in nature share a common architecture. The parasitoid needs a host species capable of providing the right environment for its development. It locates that species not through random chance, but through signals, chemical or otherwise, that the host species produces as a byproduct of its normal existence. Once the host is located, the parasitoid does not immediately destroy it, because a living host is a better developmental environment than a dead one, maintained in a functional state, sometimes for extended periods. The host sustains the parasitoid's reproductive cycle until it completes. Death of the host is the final phase, not the first, and it coincides with the emergence of something new. Translate that to the scale of civilizations. Markers locate species already producing the right signals. Industrial civilizations generating electromagnetic output that indicates the presence of technological intelligence. Rather than immediately destroying the civilization, the marker's influence maintains it in a functional state, even expands it, because a growing civilization produces more energy, more bodies, more biomass, for as long as it is running. Destruction of the civilization is the final phase of the cycle, and it coincides with the formation of something new. The parallel is precise, and it extends to one more feature that I want to name directly, because it changes how you read the moon's behavior in the Awakened DLC. Parasitoid organisms have been documented manipulating host behavior in ways that serve the parasitoid's reproductive needs. Specific infections produce specific behavioral changes in specific host species with a precision that appears designed, because in a functional sense it was designed, assembled by the pressure of natural selection over enormous spans of time into a mechanism that extracts the maximum reproductive benefit from each host encounter. The moons have something equivalent, a network spanning a galaxy, running for millions of years, processing information about every civilization it has ever consumed, learning which manipulations work on which kinds of minds, refining the signal over an incomprehensible span of trial and output. Every species the moons converted contributed to the refinement of the system. Their specific psychologies, their specific cultural vulnerabilities, their specific institutional patterns all became data that improved the signal's ability to reach the next species, which means the signal that reached humanity was not a first attempt. It was the output of a process that had already worked on every previous civilization, had been tuned by each of those encounters, and arrived at our species already knowing what kinds of minds we have, what kinds of promises we respond to, and what kinds of institutions we build around our responses. Unitology did not just happen to appeal to people experiencing resource scarcity and institutional alienation. At the signal level, it was shaped to appeal to precisely that kind of mind, because prior civilizations with similar minds had responded similarly, and the marker had learned. Now here is where this chapter, and this section of the video, arrives at the thing I have been building toward since the opening section. The question is whether we misunderstood the Brethren Moons. Most of the fandom settles on the comfortable answer, which is that the Moons are the villains of the franchise, the final boss in the largest possible sense, the ultimate enemy that the heroes failed to defeat in time. In that reading, the story of Dead Space is a tragedy with a clear shape. Humanity met something it should not have met, learned what it needed to learn too late, and paid the price. The moons are the cause, humanity is the victim. The tragedy is that the victim was never given an honest chance. That reading is not wrong. Every piece of it is accurate to the events of the narrative, and it is also the smallest possible version of what the moons are, for the same reason that calling them the biggest monster in the series is the smallest possible version of what the moon hanging over Tau Volantis was. A more complete reading runs like this. The Brethren Moons are not villains. Villains have intentions aimed at specific targets, and the moons have no more of a personal investment in any particular civilization than a wildfire has in which particular trees it burns. The moons did not decide to destroy humanity. They responded to signals humanity generated. Every red marker humanity built was a transmitter. The Unitologist movement was an institutional infrastructure for delivering biomass to collection points. Everything humanity did after finding the black marker was responding to the system the moons had already built, and the system had been built to make that response as likely and as productive as possible. The moons are not targeting us, we are in the process, and the process does not have targets. Processes have inputs and outputs. Humanity is an input, a new moon is the output. The process does not have an opinion about the input any more than a digestive system has an opinion about food. This is the reading that transforms the horror from cosmic scale to cosmic intimacy. Because if the moons were villains, we could at least position ourselves as their adversaries. We could measure our resistance against their intent and find meaning in the resistance, even if the outcome is unfavorable. Heroes Fighting Villains is a story with a shape that human beings are built to find comprehensible. Being consumed by a process is not a story with that shape. It is a story with the shape of erosion, or of digestion, or of the way starlight takes millions of years to reach an observer and arrives carrying information about something that may no longer exist. What happened to you was not aimed at you personally. Whatever consumed you was not aware of you as an individual. What produced itself from your remains was entirely unchanged by the specifics of who you were. The process ran, you were in the path of it. There is a specific kind of horror in that, and it is not the kind that resolves through courage or cleverness or knowledge. Isaac Clarke was courageous, clever as well, acquiring more knowledge about the marker system than any other human being in the franchise's history. Stopping an outbreak 3 times, crashing a moon, and still the moons arrived at Earth anyway, because his victories, while real, operated at a scale the process could afford to absorb. Which brings me back to the title question, and to the answer I have been holding since the opening section. We misunderstood the Brethren Moons by making them the story. From the first game, the moons are the background. They are the purpose behind the markers, the destination the signal is always building toward, the entity the entire franchise has been describing in stages, pulling the camera back incrementally until the scale becomes visible. Not the story, though. What happens to the people in the process is the story, which is both more intimate and more important. The moons do not care about the story and do not know there is one. For them, markers mean eventual biomass, and biomass means a new moon eventually. The details of what happens between the marker landing and the convergence completing are below the resolution of anything the moons attend to. We attend to those details because we live in them. Every log on the Ishimura, every scratch on a wall, every congregation Outman tried to protect, every dollar Isaac's mother spent climbing a church hierarchy, every calculation Dr. Serrano encoded into a device he would never live to see used, all of that is the story of people living inside a process they mostly did not know they were in. What is horrifying is the human insistence on meaning inside a system that contains none, and the remarkable things that insistence produces even when it cannot alter the outcome. Dead Space is not a story about monsters. It is a story about what intelligence does when the universe does not share its investment in its own continuation. The answer it gives is that intelligence keeps going, scratching messages on walls, building machines, encoding records in formats that might outlast everything else, sitting in a broken ship above a ruined planet trying to warn people it might never reach. Chapter 9. What the Other Media Got Wrong. Horror has been trying to describe the Brethren Moons for decades without knowing it. Every major science fiction horror franchise that dealt with alien life or biological transformation was working on the same problem Dead Space eventually solved, and most of them came close enough that comparing them to the moons reveals exactly where the genre keeps stopping short of the most disturbing version of the idea. The comparison is worth spending time on, because what Dead Space does differently is not a matter of scale alone. It is a matter of where the threat originates and who built the mechanism that delivers it. Start with the Xenomorph, because it is the most obvious point of comparison and the most instructive. The creature in the Alien franchise is, by the admission of one of the characters within the film, a perfect organism. Its structural design is matched only by its apparent indifference to anything other than its own reproductive cycle. No communication, no negotiation, no distinction between enemies and bystanders. Everything alive near it is either a host or an obstacle, and the life cycle it runs is body horror in its most concentrated form, using the human body as a developmental stage without asking permission, with the host's death built into the design as a requirement rather than a side effect. In this way, the Xenomorph describes exactly the relationship between humanity and the moons: inventory, processed, death as procedure, a new organism as the output. So what is different? Scale is the obvious answer, and it matters. A flamethrower remains a relevant tool against the Xenomorph. The creature's terrifying efficiency is contained within a space that one determined human being can navigate and survive. Ripley is the solution in those films, and Ripley works because the problem is small enough to have a human solution. The design keeps the horror at the scale of the personal and intimate, and that intimacy is exactly what makes it effective. You are afraid because you could be the host. The body being violated is a body, yours, and the specificity of that violation is profound. Moons operate at the scale of a planet, then a solar system, then a network spanning the galaxy. No human solution exists at that scale. Isaac Clarke is not Ripley. What he accomplishes is a delay at best, and he accomplishes it using equipment left by a dead civilization, not anything he manufactured himself. More importantly, the Xenomorph at least has to locate you. Something that hunts you has to look for you, and being looked for grants you a kind of significance. Horror that requires you to be seen is horror that positions you as worth seeing. A predator that tracks you down believes, on some level, that you are the relevant variable. Nothing about the moons involves looking for anyone. Markers land and transmit, and the process runs. Whoever happens to be in range becomes part of it, not because they were found, but because they were present. The Thing, John Carpenter's film, comes closest to what Dead Space does with the question of bodily integrity and the weaponization of trust. Carpenter's creature does not simply kill and discard, it becomes, wearing the people it consumes so convincingly that the people around them cannot tell. The real horror is not the deaths, but the destruction of the ability to know who is safe, which is a different and more corrosive kind of damage. What the creature shares with the moons is the treatment of the body as raw material available for reorganization. Scale is what it fundamentally lacks. The film's most terrifying quality, the slow revelation that the thing might already be inside the group, depends entirely on the group existing as a group. Remove the group and you remove the paranoia, which means you have also removed the horror. Containment within a single Antarctic station is not a flaw in the film's design. Closure is the design. The thing's horror is specifically the horror of a closed space, where the boundaries between safe and unsafe become unknowable. Dead Space begins there and then peels the walls away. The Necromorphs drew from Carpenter's creature among their influences, and you can see the shared ancestry in how they treat human tissue as a restructuring opportunity rather than a trophy. But the Dead Space the franchise eventually reveals is not a station or a ship. Civilizations become the material, and the closed space that was once a corridor on the Ishimura expands until the closed space is the observable universe. Annihilation, both the novel and its film adaptation, gestures towards something closer to the moon's register than most science fiction horror manages. The transforming zone at its center does not want anything recognizable as a goal. Everything that enters gets restructured around a logic that is internally consistent but alien to human purposes. People come out different, or do not come out at all, and the most disturbing implication of the story is that the process might not be hostile. It might simply be indifferent in a specifically active way, reorganizing everything it encounters around principles that have no relationship to human categories of good or bad, self or other. What the zone lacks is directionality. It sits in one place and affects what enters it. The encounter is optional in a way the moons never are. Your civilization can exist indefinitely without walking into that zone. A marker does not wait for you. It arrives, and it transmits, and it manufactures the conditions under which your civilization will study it, replicate it, spread it, and eventually accumulate enough biomass to trigger the next step. The trap is in the object, not in the territory around the object. War of the Worlds established the template for what people mean when they say alien invasion, and the template has endured because it maps cleanly onto anxieties about colonial encounter, about what happens when a civilization that assumed it was the most powerful thing in its vicinity turns out to be wrong. The Martians in that story are ruthless, technologically superior, and entirely uninterested in human welfare, and they die of bacteria, of the accidental incompatibility between their biology and Earth's microbial environment. That ending is hopeful in a specific way the Brethren Moons emphatically refuse. The bacteria do not know what they are doing. Humanity's survival requires nothing from humans. Something in the environment that exists independently of human action handles the threat, and all humanity has to do is outlast the attack until nature acts. Dead Space removes this possibility with precision. The moons have been consuming biological material from planets across the galaxy for millions of years. Whatever environmental incompatibilities might have existed between their biology and any given world's ecosystem were resolved before recorded human history. No accidental defense is waiting, and no environmental feature will save anything. Now look at what all of these comparisons have in common. The threat in every one of them is external. Something comes from outside the human world and enters it, and the story is about the collision between the thing from outside and the people caught inside. The xenomorph is external, entering through an airlock. Carpenter's creature is external, brought in with a research team. The Martians arrive from another planet, external to everything. Equally external is the transforming zone, appearing in a location you choose to enter. Only the marker is internal, sitting in the Yucatan Peninsula long before human civilization. The trap had already been placed inside the future of whatever intelligent life would develop on this planet. When humanity developed the technical capacity to study the object and the industrial capacity to build copies of it, we did not encounter an alien threat. We activated one that had been present in our own deep past since before the genus we belonged to existed. The threat in Dead Space was here first. This is the distinction that separates the franchise philosophically from everything that came before it, and it is the reason the moons function as a conclusion in a way that a straightforward monster does not. A monster can be killed, can be escaped. Placing a threat inside your civilization's own geological history, designed to activate at the moment your civilization becomes capable of activating it, leaves no outside from which it can be addressed. Your civilization grows into it, and civilization's ambition toward larger energy sources and expanded technical capability is the mechanism that triggers it. The drive that built everything you call progress is the thing that built the transmitter pointing at your location and called for the process to begin. No flamethrower matters here, and no bacteria will arrive on any helpful schedule, and yet humanity keeps trying, which is the last thing worth saying about the comparative tradition. Because the franchise's final image is not of a monster winning, it is of two people doing the next available thing anyway. That persistence is not a quality the genre borrowed from anywhere. There is a specific literary tradition that Dead Space sits inside more comfortably than any of the film comparisons drawn so far, and naming it changes how the whole franchise reads. The horror fiction that came out of early 20th century New England was built around a specific idea, that the universe contains intelligences so much older and larger than ours that our moral categories do not apply to them. Those stories were not interested in evil in any conventional sense. Their central move was to describe something enormous, indifferent, and busy with its own purposes, and then to observe a human mind failing to survive contact with the scale of it. The terror was not that the ancient thing wanted to hurt you. Worse was that it did not know you existed, and discovering it did not change that. Dead Space pushes that register in a specific direction. Unlike those older entities, the moons are not merely indifferent in the way the old horror fiction's entities were indifferent. Having a delivery mechanism makes all the difference. Waiting for curious humans to stumble across their resting places and go mad from the encounter is not in the design. Curiosity gets manufactured, the artifact placed, and the civilization waited upon until it develops the capacity to respond. The indifference in this story is active in a way the earlier traditions was not. It takes the terrible passivity of the cosmic and gives it a tool, and the tool is us. What makes the franchise specifically contemporary in its horror, as opposed to simply inheriting from that older tradition, is what it does with institutions. The old stories tended to feature individuals, usually scholars or investigators, who encountered the ancient thing alone and paid the individual price. Dead Space places the encounter inside an entire civilizational structure and watches the structure respond to it. Governments, corporations, scientific institutions, religious organizations, all of them encounter the signal, and all of them process it through whatever organizational logic they already possessed. All of them end up serving the process, each through a different institutional pathway. The corporation studies the marker as an energy source, because energy is what corporations are built to convert into profit. Governments classify it and develop it as a strategic asset, because that is what governments do with discovered advantages. Around the signal, a church forms and builds a theology of convergence, because that is what communities do when they share an overwhelming experience they cannot account for by other means. None of these institutions were corrupted by an external force. All of them followed their own nature directly into the service of the process. That is what the older tradition lacked, and what Dead Space delivers. The monster that gets you through your own civilization's institutional logic, using the same mechanisms that normally protect and perpetuate the civilization, is the monster that has genuinely moved the genre forward. One of the franchise's designers described the moons as the fictional wrapper for everything the series had been building. A wrapper does not contain what is inside it. Rather, it describes the shape of what is inside from the outside, at the resolution where the full contours become legible. The moons describe the shape of everything the franchise had been saying since the first hour of the first game, from the outside, at the scale where it finally becomes visible. Running through all 3 games, it takes all 3 to make it clear. What it had been saying all along is what the next chapter is going to answer directly. Chapter 10. The answer was in the signal. Let me name the misunderstanding directly. We understood the Brethren Moons as villains because that is the grammar of horror. The genre requires a threat with an agenda, which can be simple, survival or hunger, or it can be complex, ideology or appetite, or ancient malevolence. But there has to be something that wants something, and the something it wants has to be opposed to what the protagonist wants. Without that opposition, you do not have a monster, you have weather. Running at a scale beyond the relevant scale of any individual, weather damages, kills, rearranges, erases. Weather does not have villains, but it matters enormously to the people in it. The Brethren Moons are weather, not in any dismissive sense. Their arrival ends civilizations, and their signal shapes the course of intelligent life across the galaxy. Every marker humanity ever found or built was an expression of their continuing presence in the landscape of this solar system. But mattering and being villains are different things, and the franchise spent 3 games building toward the revelation that these 2 categories do not overlap here. A villain opposes, the moons do not oppose anything, they reproduce. Reproduction requires biomass. Biomass is what civilizations are made of, which means civilizations in the path of the process are not enemies of the process, they are fuel. Fuel does not have a relationship with a fire beyond proximity and combustion. This is the first misunderstanding. We framed them as enemies when they are a mechanism. The second misunderstanding follows from the first. If the moons are the enemy, then the outbreaks are their weapon, and the weapon is what the story is about. Fighting the Necromorphs becomes fighting the enemy. Destroying markers becomes attacking the enemy's supply line. Isaac's victories look like military victories in a war with a clear shape. Humanity on one side, the moons on the other, and the outbreaks as the contested territory between them. That framing produces a story in which Isaac is heroic in the conventional sense. He resists, locally and repeatedly, he wins. He is the human element the enemy cannot account for, and his persistence represents something about human potential against impossible odds. Courage meets impossibility and holds its ground. What the Awakened DLC quietly delivers is a more honest framing. The war framing was never accurate. Isaac was not fighting a war. He was operating inside a process, containing local expressions of that process at enormous personal cost, in a universe where the process had already run to completion elsewhere and was continuing to run on a timeline no individual action could meaningfully alter. His victories were real. They were also contained within a parenthesis. The process continued on either side of them. This is the second misunderstanding. We called the outbreaks the horror when they were the logistics of producing a Brethren Moon. Necromorphs gather biomass, the hive mind coordinates the gathering, and the marker manages the timeline. All of it is preparation for an event that is not combat and is not invasion. Reproduction is what it is, and the horror is not in the logistics any more than the horror of an industrial process is in the shipping department. Where the horror lives is in what the logistics are building toward, and what they are building toward is another moon, another node in a network that has been running for longer than our species has been upright. We called the outbreaks the horror because we were inside them. Of course we did. When something assembled from a crew member comes down a corridor on the Ishimura, the corridor is the whole world. The process is not the corridor. It is what is using the corridor, and you are not the point of the corridor. And the Necromorph coming at you is a manufacturing step that you happen to be interrupting because you happen to be standing in the way, which leads to the third misunderstanding. We called Isaac's story the fight when it was the interruption. Now here is the deeper question, the one that has been waiting underneath all of this since the title appeared. Why do we want to misunderstand them? Villain framing is not an accident or a failure of imagination. It is a specific psychological need expressed as a genre convention. Monsters that want things, that have agendas we can oppose, are monsters we can cope with. Something with a goal can be diverted. With a weakness, it can be defeated. A threat that responds to the protagonist's actions in meaningful ways is one over which the protagonist has influence, and influence is what makes fear bearable. Remove the agenda and what remains is the unmodified scale of the thing. Permanence is all that remains when you remove the weakness. Strip away the response to the protagonist's actions, and what remains is the recognition that the protagonist was never a significant variable in the outcome. Horror at that scale does not produce the focused fear that makes a monster scary in the conventional sense. What it produces is something closer to the feeling of standing at a canyon's edge in darkness, where the space below is not dangerous in any targeted way, but simply there, vast and present and infinitely more enduring than you are. Most people do not go to horror for that feeling. They go for the other kind, the kind that comes with a protagonist who matters, a threat that can be stopped if the right things happen, and an ending that resolves into something. Dead Space 3 offers a different ending, and the Awakened DLC offers an even more different one. Resolution is not what arrives. Something closer to recognition arrives, of what was always true, of what the franchise had always been building toward, of what the first slasher in the first corridor was always pointing at. Now look at the franchise's own response to all of this, because it is its own kind of comment on the psychology we have just described. The franchise ended. No fourth game addressed what happened to Earth, and no sequel resolved whether Isaac and Carver survived the impact of a moon against their ship's hull, or whether Ellie made it back, or whether anything of humanity survived the convergence running across Earth's surface as the DLC concluded. The remake returned to the Ishimura, back to the beginning, to the corridor, before any of it had been understood. Some people read that return as a commercial decision about familiar settings, and that reading is probably accurate in part, but there is something in it that resonates beyond the commercial, because the structure of the return matches the structure of the moons themselves. With each civilization that finds one, the same sequence runs. Markers land, the process begins again. The signal transmits, the compulsion spreads, copies get built, and biomass accumulates. Playing the remake means entering the process for the first time, again, with the strange doubled awareness that comes from remembering what the corridor leads to. The marker has been there the whole time. The signal running, the network awake and circling somewhere beyond the hull of a ship you cannot see out of. Begin again. Now let me come to the title, because everything in this video has been building toward an honest reading of those two words, Dead Space. We started with the ritual geometry, the ring of necromorphs gathered around the marker at the moment convergence initiates, the empty stillness at the center where nothing moves, the circle of gathered dead around a silence they are in the process of filling. Dead space as the calm eye of the process, the zone of stillness before the birth. This was always a description of a ritual, and the ritual is older than humanity. 10 chapters later, the phrase carries more. Inside those two words, the signal, the compulsion that builds copies, a church constructed from a dead man's beliefs by men who killed him, copies spreading across human space, each one a transmitter pointing homeward, outbreaks running their manufacturing cycle on every ship and station and planet they reach. A machine on a frozen world, doing the one thing a dying civilization managed to accomplish before they were consumed. A moon in mid-birth waiting 2 million years for someone to arrive and make a decision about it. A man who spent 3 games interrupting the process and could not stop it. A network calling to each other across a galaxy of silence that was silent because everything that might have answered had already become part of the network. All of it inside those two words. Dead space is not absence, it is completion. Rock, flesh, and the memory of the civilization that was there all get assembled into something that will go on and do the same thing somewhere else. Below, the planet stripped of the crust that gave it geography. At the center, the marker broadcasting outward to the next receiver. Dead space is what civilizations become. Now here is the reading that ties the whole video together, the one I have been holding since the opening image. The message the moons transmit is "make us whole." That is what the signal says, in every language it can reach, in every mind it can access. Build the copies, gather the biomass, complete the convergence, become part of what we are. The terror of that message is in the word whole. Whole implies something incomplete, something that still needs, that is not yet fully what it is going to be, and that communicates the need outward to whatever can hear it. Consider the scale of that against the scale of what the moons are. Ancient beyond any useful measurement, spanning a galaxy, having consumed every civilization they have ever encountered, among the most powerful entities the genre has ever described, and broadcasting into the minds of every living thing within range a message that says they are not finished, still not whole. The network grows with each world devoured, and still the message reaches outward, "make us whole." What if the message is accurate? Something that has existed for millions of years and converted countless civilizations into additional nodes in its own network. What if it still has a genuine experience of incompleteness? What if the drive to expand is not only a reproductive imperative, but something closer to what that drive feels like from the inside? A genuine lack that the accumulation of more biomass and more nodes and more of everything the moons already have in abundance has never managed to fill. Declining to answer is the right decision for the games to make. Whether the moons experience their own existence as a deficit, as something still to be addressed, as a need the process serves but never resolves, is a question that lands differently depending on when you ask it. Early in the first game, standing over a slasher, the question has no purchase. At the end of the DLC, watching the sky above Earth fill with things that have been doing this for millions of years, the question arrives with weight that does not leave. Because if the moons are telling the truth when they say they are not yet whole, then whatever drives the process is not satisfied by the process. The network keeps growing, and the signal keeps reaching outward. Somewhere in the dark between stars, there is always a new civilization developing the technical capacity to hear it for the first time, and the message that arrives in their minds and feels like their own idea is the same message that arrived in ours, in the same words, carrying the same compulsion. Make us whole, begin again. The moons describe the shape of everything the franchise had been saying since the first hour of the first game. From the outside, at the scale where it finally becomes visible. Running through all three games, it takes all three to make it clear. The message is this: we are not the point, and we were never the point. The signal does not care about our stories, our institutions, our loves, our losses, our remarkable individual capacity for persistence in situations that do not reward persistence. Transmission continues at whatever rate it continues, and eventually something arrives that can hear it, and the process runs, and whatever that something built along the way becomes part of the shell of the next moon. And yet, a log on a wall, a note for a stranger, a person who understood what was coming and encoded the codex anyway, an engineer who had nothing left and reconfigured an alien machine that someone else had designed and never finished, aiming it at a thing the size of a moon. Every one of those acts occurred inside a process that could not be stopped, succeeded in whatever small local thing it attempted, failed to stop the process and was done anyway, and you watched the whole thing anyway, which is the thing worth staying with for a moment, because the franchise knows you did. The entire architecture of the series is built around a specific relationship with the player that most horror games handle differently. Most horror games want you afraid. They construct situations designed to produce the fight or flight response, to make your hands shake and your attention sharpen, to activate the same neurological machinery that fear activates in any real-life dangerous situation. Being scared is the point, and the better the game executes the mechanics of fear, the better it has done its job. Dead Space is a horror game that also wants you afraid. The slashers and the vents and the darkness and the limited resources are all doing the work horror games do. But Dead Space 3 and the Awakened DLC are doing something additional that most horror games never attempt. They want you to understand. Understanding is not compatible with the fight or flight response. You cannot be genuinely afraid and genuinely analytical at the same time. The two states use the same cognitive resources in competing directions. What the franchise builds across 3 games is a gradual conversion of the player's relationship with the Necromorphs from fear to comprehension. And then, at the point of maximum comprehension, it shows you the moons, which are the thing comprehension cannot protect you from. The escalation across 3 games is not just a narrative escalation from ship to station to planet to galaxy. It is a psychological escalation from fear to understanding, to the thing beyond understanding, and the moons are placed exactly at the point where the understanding you have built becomes insufficient. By Dead Space 3, you understand the slasher, knowing how it was made, what drives it, where the vulnerability sits, how to stop it. Understanding the hive mind comes next in the first game. Having learned to read the infection's hierarchy by this point, and the fight against it is a confrontation between your accumulated knowledge and the embodiment of what that knowledge was preparing you for. By Dead Space 3, you understand enough about the convergent cycle that the mechanisms are no longer frightening in themselves. What is frightening is the scale of what you understand. This is unusual in horror. The genre generally assumes that understanding reduces fear, and works hard to delay understanding in order to keep the fear at productive levels. Dead Space 3 bets that understanding increases a specific, different kind of fear, the kind that arrives not from the unknown, but from the fully known. When you understand exactly what the moons are, what they represent in the context of the entire galaxy, and what the signal that has been in your head since the first game was always pointing at, the fear that arrives is not the fear of the corridor. It is the fear of the diagram, the cold recognition of a system operating precisely as designed, at a scale that makes everything you have done inside it exactly as consequential as it was. The player spent 3 games being the person who made a difference. At the end of the third, the franchise hands back a precise accounting of what that difference was worth at the scale of the actual problem. And still you came, still played, still held the plasma cutter, and aimed for the limbs and kept going down the corridor, because the alternative to going down the corridor is not going down it. And nobody who watched Isaac Clarke navigate the Ishimura for the first time believed that not going was an option he would choose. That is the relationship the franchise builds with the player that makes the ending land as hard as it does. The moons arrive at Earth not to defeat a character the player has grown attached to. They arrive to close the loop on a question the franchise has been asking since the first game, given full knowledge of how the process works, given an accurate understanding of the scale of what you are facing. What does a person with all of that knowledge do? The answer the franchise shows is the next thing available. And then, quietly, it asks whether you think that answer is enough. Before I close, there is something I want to say about what this video has been doing, and what the franchise invites you to do with the understanding you have built across it. Most analysis of the Dead Space franchise focuses on what the moons are, which is the question we opened with, and the analysis tends to stop once the cosmological picture is complete. Planet-sized necromorphs, formed from convergence events, running the network, serving as the source of the marker signal, and the reason it says, "Make us whole." All of that is true, and none of it is the point. The point is what the franchise does with the gap between the scale of the process and the scale of the people inside it. That gap is where all the actual storytelling lives, where all the specific horror and specific dignity of the series reside. The moons are the context for the logs on the Ishimura, not the content of them. They are what gives the scratches on the walls their weight. Because scratching a message on a wall only matters if there is something large enough behind you to make the scratch almost certainly useless. And the franchise keeps returning to the scratch, the log, the message encoded for a stranger who might arrive 200 years later, the moment a person understood what was happening and did the next thing anyway. All of those acts occurred inside a process that could not be stopped. All of them mattered to the people they happened to. The moons do not know any of them happened. We do. The corridors belong to the process, and the marker signal, and the accumulated biomass, knowing that the people in the corridors were people, with histories and purposes, and a stubborn insistence on moving forward anyway, belongs to no one in the franchise but the player. And the player keeps coming back, returning to the Ishimura, holding the plasma cutter, aiming for the limbs, knowing what is coming and doing it anyway. Because knowing what is coming has never been the thing that stops a person who has decided to keep moving. That is not a victory over the moons. It is something the moons will never understand. And in a story about a process that consumes everything, that is the only kind of thing that matters.